Hey guys, tonight we're going to spend some time wandering through the quieter corners of 1800s America. Those rooms behind lace curtains and wallpapered parlours where women lived their entire lives without ever marrying. You probably won't survive this, let's be real. Not unless you've got nerves of steel, an appetite for threadbare reputations, and the patience to smile through 100 judgmental church ladies and twice as many side eyes at the general store. But if you're up for it, we'll peek into the lives of the women history politely forgot, or mislabel with words like spinster. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps. And hey, where are you tuning in from tonight? What's the time where you are? Just drop it in the comments. I like seeing all the little glowing dots across the map before we tuck in. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're 27 years old, you have no husband, you own precisely 0 suitors, 0 prospects, and too many cats. 2. You didn't mean for things to go this way, it just happened. Or didn't happen, really. You were busy helping with your sister's children, then your father needed care, and you always told yourself you'd marry when the right man came along. Well, he didn't. Or maybe you just didn't say yes. And now here you are, officially a spinster, because the 1800s have 0 chill when it comes to labelling unmarried women past their prime. Let's be clear, spinster didn't start out as an insult. Originally, it just meant a woman who spun thread, a job many unmarried women took up to support themselves. But language is slippery, and by the 19th century, spinster came with a full bouquet of social pity, low-grade mockery and quiet suspicion. You're seen as either pitiful or strange, maybe both. And if you have opinions, oh no, now you're difficult. People assume things, that you must be sad, bitter or frigid, that you wanted marriage and failed to land it, that you linger at windows in melancholy silence, embroidering cushions while slowly being consumed by regret. Meanwhile, your married cousins are on their 3rd childbirth and secretly dreaming of your silent evenings and well-fluffed pillows. You live either in your father's house or tucked into the attic of your married brother's home. If you're lucky, you've inherited just enough from a great-aunt to live semi-independently in a modest boarding house surrounded by other unmarried women, each with their own code of silence and small kindnesses, like leaving extra butter on your breakfast tray when you've had a bad week. The biggest insult tossed around about spinsters is not that you're poor, or even that you're unmarried, but that you're unwanted. The idea that no one chose you, that you failed the big game of womanhood, bruises more than anyone admits. Yet quietly around you, a tiny resistance builds. You get up each morning and keep living your life anyway. And you're not alone. Across the country, unmarried women are doing all sorts of things quietly deemed scandalous. They teach, they write, they run small businesses, they read novels in public, and sometimes, brace yourself, they don't immediately put their eyes down when a man enters the room. In fact, some of them write anonymous advice columns telling married women how to be less boring. Looking at you, Fanny Fern. But let's stay with you. You haven't written a novel yet, but you have learned how to dodge questions at church and deflect matchmaking attempts with the well-practiced line, "I'm content with my life as it is." It's a lie. You're mostly content. You miss having someone to bring you tea when you're sick. You worry about dying alone and being found by the cat. You also secretly enjoy your quiet morning walks and the fact that no one tells you what to cook for dinner. Here's something strange. The US Census has started counting people like you, noticing statistically how many women aren't married by 30. And it's rising. Just a little. Quietly. The historians of the future will look back and wonder what that means. What stirred in women's minds during this time that made a life without marriage seem possible. Not preferable, necessarily, but survivable. One historical fact. By the mid-1800s, unmarried white women in northern states actually made up a sizable chunk of the teaching workforce. It was one of the only professions respectable enough for single women, though you had to quit the second you married. Because clearly one cannot both teach and be married. Scandalous. Now here's something quirkier. There were entire etiquette manuals on how unmarried women should behave. Don't walk too fast, don't laugh too loud, and absolutely do not look as though you're enjoying life too much. You might give the impression that spinsterhood is fun, and we can't have that, now can we? And here's the part that still sparks debate. Were these women choosing to remain single, or were they cornered by circumstances, economic, social, geographic. Some historians argue that the label of spinster erases the idea of choice, that many women did refuse marriage because the options were dismal. Others say it's a stretch, that most simply never had the chance and made the best of it afterward. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in between, a messy mix of agency and accident, of doors closed and others walked through. So tonight we begin with your face in the mirror, calm, composed, maybe a little tired. You tug on your gloves, pick up your reticule, and step out into the chilly morning. Someone watches from behind a curtain. Someone else nods politely as you pass. You're just the spinster down the street, the woman with the straight back and the mysterious eyes, and you're going to make it through today like you did the last one, with quiet determination and just enough powdered sugar in your breakfast scone. Let's rewind just a little, back before that morning walk and the careful scone with powdered sugar. Because this strange position you now hold in society, it didn't happen overnight. It started centuries earlier, when women who lived outside the expected script were given one of two roles: wife, or something vaguely sinister, or worse, something supernatural. In early America, the idea of the unmarried woman was already wrapped in folklore and old-world suspicion. You weren't just a person with free time and no husband. You were a loose thread in the tightly sewn fabric of the community. If you didn't belong to a man, then what were you? Dangerous? Divine? A little of both? Picture a small Puritan town in New England. Cobblestone streets, the smell of wet wool, firewood, and boiled cabbage in the air. Now picture a woman in her 40s, unmarried, sharp-eyed, and skilled with herbs. She's helped deliver babies. She lives on the edge of town, and she speaks a little too freely at the town meeting. You know exactly where this is going. In the late 1600s, unmarried women were disproportionately accused of witchcraft. It wasn't only spinsters, but let's just say if you weren't married and had a cat, things didn't look good. You were too self-sufficient, too solitary. The idea that you could survive or even thrive without a man must have seemed suspicious to a society built on male ownership and female dependence. And so, the myth began. If you weren't a wife, you must be something other. By the 1800s, witch hunts were long over, at least officially, but the shadow of those ideas lingered. Women who stepped outside the box still made people uncomfortable. They were either pitied or moralized or just talked about in hushed tones over Sunday dinner. The unmarried woman in your town, she's probably lonely, or maybe proud, or maybe she reads too much. You know, books with ideas in them. Of course, you don't need a literal witch hunt to ruin someone's reputation. All you need is a small community, a church pew, and a good memory. People keep tabs on your behaviour. You don't go to dances anymore. You never flirt. And heaven help you if you're caught laughing with a younger man. It's not flirtation, it's desperation, according to Mrs. Alderson, who lives 2 houses down and hasn't minded her own business since 1824. But back to you. You've been dodging assumptions since you turned 25. No, you're not secretly in love with your cousin. No, you didn't have your heart broken by a man who died in the war. No, you're not saving yourself for the Lord. You just didn't marry. And that fact sits in people's minds like a question mark they can't erase. Still, you've noticed something. The suspicion cuts both ways. You're seen as a little threatening, but that comes with a strange sort of freedom. No one tells you how to dress. No one critiques your parenting. You have no children. You don't answer to a husband. And over time, that outsider status becomes a kind of soft power. People come to you for advice. You're steady, discreet. You know everyone's secrets and keep them all buried in the garden with the marigolds. In the South, the dynamic is even more layered. The plantation economy and strict gender roles mean that white women are expected to marry early and perform the genteel duties of wifehood, entertaining, childbearing, managing enslaved workers if their husbands are wealthy. If you don't marry, you're considered a family failure. But behind closed doors, unmarried women often play quiet, crucial roles, raising nieces and nephews, managing estates after widows pass on, or serving as unofficial historians of the family lineage. You become the memory keeper, the person who knows where the old letters are stored, the only one who remembers how Grandpa took his coffee. You're essential, but still peripheral. One historical fact worth tucking under your pillow tonight. In many American towns in the early 1800s, particularly rural ones, there were more eligible women than men. Frontier life meant a lot of men travelled west or died young, and the resulting demographic imbalance meant not everyone could marry, even if they wanted to. So you, and thousands of other women, found yourselves living lives that didn't fit the expected mould, and quietly creating new ones. Now for something weirder. In certain spiritualist circles of the 19th century, especially as seances and ghost talking gained popularity, unmarried women were considered to be more tuned into the spiritual world. Why? Because they hadn't been, tainted by the carnal distractions of marriage. Yes, really. Spinsterhood became weirdly linked to mystical sensitivity, and some women leaned into this, becoming mediums, clairvoyants, or cultish figureheads. Who needs a husband when you can talk to the dead? And now for the debate. Scholars still argue whether the social suspicion aimed at unmarried women was more about gender or economic productivity. In other words, was the judgment because you weren't fulfilling your biological destiny of bearing children, or because you were an adult not anchored to a man's household or wallet? It's probably both. Being unmarried meant being unanchored, and that unsettled a society obsessed with order. Let's wrap this chapter as the sun sets over your modest town. You've lit a lamp, stirred the fire, and pulled a quilt across your lap. Somewhere in the distance a fiddle plays. Someone's wedding celebration, maybe. You don't go to those anymore. Not because you're bitter, but because the cake always tastes like chalk and the small talk is excruciating. Instead, you settle in with your embroidery and your thoughts, and a small smile plays on your lips. Because you know something they don't. You may not have a husband, but you have a life. And despite everything, it's still yours. You hear the news before breakfast. Mr. Calhoun down the road has passed, leaving his wife alone with 3 children and a family business that nobody believes she can run. There's whispered pity in the air, then a sort of uneasy silence, because now Mrs. Calhoun is a widow, and that puts her in a strange new category. She's no longer protected by marriage, but she's not a spinster either. She had a husband, she played the game, and now she has something you don't. Sympathy. Widowhood in the 1800s is a social grey zone, mournful, but not powerless. If a woman played her cards right, she could use it as a quiet path to independence. You think of your neighbour, Mrs. Bellamy, who wears black crepe-like armour and somehow seems stronger now than when her husband was alive. There's a gleam in her eye these days that suggests she's discovered something, freedom wrapped in tragedy. As an unmarried woman, you don't get that kind of power, but a widow, she can inherit property. She can manage her own affairs, at least for a time. Of course, how much freedom she gets depends on where she lives, what colour her skin is, and whether any male heirs are waiting in the wings to relieve her of responsibility. Still, the widow has a legitimacy that the never-married do not. She was chosen once. That matters. You're aware of this, even if no one says it aloud. A widow at 40 is pitied but respected. A spinster at 40 is ignored, or worse, mocked in church newsletters under the guise of prayerful concern. You once overheard someone say she just never found the right man, with a sigh so heavy it could have snapped a pew in half. But sometimes, you find yourself envying the widow, not for her loss of course, but for her access. She can walk alone to the market without being questioned. She can refuse suitors and no one presses. She can speak plainly and people listen, and if she wears a veil, no one expects her to smile. You've watched how widowhood changes a woman. Some become fragile birds, always on the verge of collapse. Others go full steel spine. They run shops. They buy land. They hire help and build gardens and say no more than yes. Some even remarry, but carefully, as if choosing a second husband the way one might select a sturdy walking stick. You learn to observe them all, quietly cataloguing the choices they make, trying to understand what kind of life might still be possible without a husband's shadow looming nearby. Now here's a historical fact to stir into your tea. In some states during the early 1800s, married women had virtually no legal identity. They couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even control their own wages. But widows, especially if they had no adult sons, could inherit estates, take legal action, and make decisions. Ironically, a woman might gain more autonomy through the death of a spouse than she ever had in life, and here's something more peculiar. Among certain rural communities there developed a kind of widow economy. Widowed women would form informal networks, watching each other's children, pooling resources, sharing preserves and sewing circles not just for companionship but mutual survival. These networks often existed under the radar, woven through letters and kitchen visits. No charity, no spectacle, just quiet resilience. You know one such widow well, Mrs. Haverley. She lost her husband to an accident in the sawmill, and within a year she'd taken over the books, repaired the barn, and hired 2 local boys to do the heavy work. Her house smells like cinnamon and ledger ink. She has opinions about everything, and shares them freely over card games with other widows on Thursday nights. You're not quite in the circle, you haven't earned the badge of sorrow, but sometimes you're invited to bring pie and listen. That's something. The open question scholars still wrestle with is this: did widowhood in the 1800s really open doors for women, or just trap them in a different room of the same house? Some argue that society tolerated widows' independence because it was framed in loss. They were still feminine, still moral, still tamed by marriage. Others suggest that widows quietly redefined womanhood by showing you could be powerful without a man beside you. The truth likely bends between both, loss as license but also quiet revolution. You start to see it more clearly with time. Widowhood is a kind of armour, sombre but protective. It gives women a shield made of memories and mourning, under which they do what needs doing. They are rarely questioned, and if they are, they cry. Tears are a weapon, one you do not have. As for you, you remain unclaimed. Your independence is not born of death, but of delay, or decision, or simply the slow erosion of options. No one offers casseroles for your solitude. No one stops by with black crepe or prayer books. You just keep going, without the ceremonial badge that says, "She once belonged." Still, there are small graces. You can leave a party when you want. You can keep a drawer of personal letters without explanation. You can rearrange your parlour furniture 6 times a year, and no one scolds you. But you also carry the weight of being perpetually outside, of being the story without the climax, the character no one applauds. Sometimes you think, maybe it would have been easier if someone had died, and then you feel guilty for even thinking it. Outside your window, a few birds pick through the snow for seeds. The sky is pale with evening. Somewhere in town, a young bride is lighting a new hearth, full of hope and blind certainty. And somewhere else, a widow is locking her door against the wind, filing papers by candlelight, sipping strong tea she didn't ask permission to brew. You belong to neither world, not entirely, but you watch, you learn, and you build your own way through. There's a knock at the door this morning, gentle but insistent. You pause mid-sweep, apron dusted in flour, and open it to find a young girl, barely 16, clutching her gloves like they might fly away. She wants to know if you'll help her prepare for the schoolteacher's exam. You agree, of course. She's nervous, her voice shaking. "I don't know if I can do it," she says, and you give her the same look your old tutor gave you. Eyebrows lifted, calm and firm. Then you'll do it anyway. This is the part they never mention in the books, the quiet apprenticeship of unmarried women. You become a mentor by default, not because anyone crowned you wise, but because you didn't disappear into marriage, and people notice you're still here, still steady, still reading, thinking, correcting people's grammar under your breath. Teaching is one of the few respectable professions left open to someone like you, and you know it's shaped well. The chalk dust, the stiff collars, the tin lunchbox balanced on your lap during the midday bell. In the 1800s, teaching is one of the only jobs society allows an unmarried woman to do without scandal. There are conditions, of course. You must remain morally upright, which really just means no men, no laughter that's too loud, and certainly no hints of worldly ambition. You wear sombre colours, you keep your hair neat, you work long hours, often boarding with local families who eye you like you're a misbuttoned jacket. Useful but slightly out of place. Still, there's something powerful about standing in front of a classroom, pointer in hand, a room full of squirming children suddenly going still at your voice. You teach letters and numbers, but also posture, politeness, and how to avoid ending sentences with prepositions. Sometimes a student brings you an apple, bruised but bright, and for a moment you feel seen. But if you marry, that all goes away. Most schools require female teachers to be single. Marriage is considered a distraction, and worse, proof that you've crossed some invisible boundary of respectability. A wife is no longer impartial. She has loyalties, she has someone to obey. So schools fire married women and replace them with fresh-faced spinsters. It's a revolving door of bright-eyed girls who've read McGuffey's, read a cover to cover and still wear ribbons in their hair. You've lasted longer than most, slipping past 30 without incident. No rings, no rumours, just you and the click of the schoolroom clock year after year. You live simply, save money, and sometimes allow yourself a small indulgence, a new pen, a slice of cake at the bakery, a library subscription that lets you request one novel per month, shipped in from Boston with cracked covers and marginalia left by strangers. Here's a solid historical fact to chew on between bites of that imaginary cake. By 1850, teaching had become the most common occupation for unmarried white women in the United States. It was seen as a natural extension of women's domestic skills, though paid significantly less than male teachers and with far more scrutiny. You were expected to be a moral model, a social mirror, and a tireless academic, all for less than a carpenter's apprentice earned. And now for the quirky side of things. Some school districts, not all, but enough to make you raise an eyebrow, had bizarre rules for their female teachers. One infamous teacher's contract from the era includes gems like, you may not ride in a carriage with any man unless he is your father or brother. You may not loiter in downtown ice cream parlours. You must wear at least 2 petticoats. 2, always. God forbid your ankles suggest rebellion. You learn to navigate it. You smile at the right people, keep your shoes clean, and memorise the school inspector's favourite Bible verses in case he drops by unannounced. And when the day ends, you let your shoulders relax and walk home past neighbours who nod politely but never invite you to supper. You are safe but solitary, useful but not cherished. And here's where the debate comes in. Some scholars argue that teaching gave unmarried women genuine power and a foothold in public life, that they became cultural gatekeepers, subtly shaping the minds of a generation. Others push back, saying it was just another form of gendered control, keeping women in a service role underpaid and easily replaced. The truth, as usual, sits somewhere awkwardly in the middle. You teach not because it's empowering or radical, but because it's what you can do. And because sometimes, when a girl like the one from this morning passes her exam and beams at you with pink cheeks and wide eyes, it feels like enough, like you've passed something on, like you've mattered. There's a moment late one afternoon, chalky light slanting through the window, your skirt brushing against the desk, that you find yourself humming. A hymn, something about rivers and time. The children are gone, and for a second the room feels like a chapel. Not sacred because of the lessons, but because you've survived another year inside it. You go home and remove your boots with a sigh. You count your coins. You've saved enough for a new winter coat, or maybe a train ticket. But where would you go? This little town may not love you, but it knows you. And there's something to be said for being known, even if it's just as that unmarried teacher with the sharp tongue. You pour yourself tea and pull out the essay you started weeks ago, something about women's work and invisible labour. It'll never be published, but it's yours. And in the silence, you write one more paragraph before the oil lamp flickers low and the shadows crawl in. Soft and slow. The wind's sharper tonight, rattling the loose pane in the kitchen window. You think about fixing it, then don't. Instead, you sip a lukewarm broth and stare at the wallpaper. Faded roses curling upward in endless, floral optimism. It's quiet, mostly, except for the creaks. The floorboards whisper when no one walks on them. The radiator hisses like a long-held breath. And in the room across the hall, Mrs. Waverley's rocking chair keeps time with ghosts. Welcome to the boarding house. You didn't choose it, not exactly. After your father died, and your brother's wife started calling you helpful, you understood. You packed your things, kissed your nieces on the forehead, and moved out before anyone had to say it aloud. And here you are now, one of 5 unmarried women sharing a long, drafty house with suspicious plumbing, and a landlady who's deaf in one ear, but hears everything else just fine. Boarding houses in the 1800s are a strange kind of limbo. Not quite private, not entirely public. You rent a room the size of a pantry and share everything else. The parlour, the water pump, the table where everyone pretends not to watch how much you eat. It's a roof over your head, but it comes with conditions, whispers, unspoken rules, and neighbours with ears sharper than their sewing needles. Most of the women here are like you, single, drifting just beyond society's neatly stitched hems. There's Miss Clara, who once had a fiancé until he vanished to California and never returned. There's Agnes, whose mother insists she's just taking her time. And there's Lucinda, who's 42, smokes on the porch and says exactly what she means whether people like it or not. She's your favourite. You all orbit around each other in cautious comfort. You don't ask too many questions. You lend handkerchiefs. You trade magazines. You compliment bonnets with just enough sincerity to get through the day. And when someone's been crying behind their door, you pretend not to notice, but you knock gently the next morning and ask if they want toast. Here's your fact for the night. Boarding houses were incredibly common for single women in the 19th century, especially in growing cities. With few economic options and little chance of owning property, these shared homes became the default answer for women who needed a place to exist without immediate male supervision. Some were genteel and strictly monitored, others were a little rougher, less about lace curtains, more about loud neighbours and undercooked stew. And here's something odd but true. Many women actually preferred them. Not necessarily because they loved the communal bathrooms, but because they offered freedom. You could come and go, keep your own schedule, read novels by lamplight without someone asking why you weren't darning socks, and more importantly, you were surrounded by others like you. It was a kind of accidental sisterhood. Still, you're always being watched. The neighbours across the street have opinions. Every time a man visits the boarding house, even if it's just a cousin or the preacher, curtains twitch. The landlady keeps a notebook, just a small one, where she records minor infractions. Late returns, loud voices, skirts too short by an inch. She calls it house order, but everyone knows it's gossip in cursive. Sometimes, walking home from the market, you hear whispers, "I don't know how they live like that." No husbands, just all together. There's always a pause, as if they're trying to imagine what actually happens inside your quiet halls. Do you sit in your underclothes playing cards by candlelight? Do you dance without music? Do you conspire? The answer, of course, is yes. Sometimes. On Tuesday nights, Lucinda smuggles in brandy. You drink it from chipped teacups, sitting cross-legged on the floor like girls at a sleepover that never ended. You tell stories, not always true, but always interesting. Clara does voices. Agnes blushes. You laugh until you wheeze, and then someone sighs, long and deep, and the room goes quiet for a while. There's a kind of intimacy and shared invisibility. You learn each other's footsteps, coughs, creaks in the floor. You learn who snores, who prays out loud, who folds their letters in thirds instead of halves. And when someone gets bad news, a rejection, a death, a letter that never came, you sit close but don't ask questions. Sometimes being near is enough. The scholarly debate around boarding houses is surprisingly fierce. Some historians call them early models of female autonomy, places where women carved out economic and social space in a world that left them none. Others argue they were liminal traps, reinforcing women's dependency by placing them under new forms of surveillance. One roof exchanged for another. Both arguments have weight. But you're too tired tonight to care about academia, and you light a lamp and brush your hair by the mirror. It's getting more silver than not. The line between tired and wise blurs in the reflection. Your room smells faintly of lavender and dust, and the wind's howling like a lost child down the chimney. You remember your old bedroom in your father's house. How the floor was crooked and the window faced east. How you used to read until your eyes burned, dreaming of the cities in your novels. Boston, Philadelphia. Places where women lived in apartments and drank coffee from real cafes. You thought you'd get there. You didn't. But you have this. A small bed, a creaky chair, a lock on your door, a life. And sometimes, on nights like this, that's enough. You wake to church bells. Sunday, which means starching your collar, brushing lint off your coat and preparing to sit still while someone reminds you that woman was made from man and for man, and anything else is a rebellion against God's natural order. You do this every week. You're very practiced at appearing devout while mentally reciting grocery lists and mentally drafting sarcastic footnotes to the sermon. It's almost a sport now. You file into the pew behind the widow Barclay, who wears her grief like a weapon. Beside you, Miss Clara adjusts her gloves and whispers, "His sermon last week had 3 points and 0 theology." You suppress a smile. Then the music starts, the hymns rise, and your thoughts drift, upward, sideways, inward. Because behind the stained glass and organ music lurks the thing you've never quite outrun, the cult of true womanhood. You didn't join it, it joined you, like a ghost stitched into every hem, a whisper in every room that told women exactly who they should be, pious, pure, submissive and domestic. That was the list. 4 neat pillars, and if you didn't meet all 4, well, someone would gently suggest you try harder. You remember being taught as a girl that the ideal woman was like a rose kept under glass, protected, admired, fragrant and utterly useless in a strong wind. The moment she had thoughts of her own, or reached for anything outside her little dome, the petals began to wither. Or so they said. The cult of true womanhood wasn't a literal cult, of course. But in the 1800s, it was an omnipresent standard, a social doctrine stronger than any law. If you were a woman, You were expected to embody moral virtue, sexual restraint, and quiet obedience. Your purpose was to reflect a husband's glory and nurture his children. Anything else was seen as unnatural, even dangerous, which of course made you dangerous. Not in the thrilling femme fatale way, more in the slightly unsettling, why hasn't she settled down kind of way. You've broken the unspoken contract. You didn't marry, you didn't bear children, you didn't transform into a living altar of devotion to some man's ambition. You've been living off script and people notice. One of the hardest parts about being an unmarried woman isn't the loneliness, it's the scrutiny. The way every choice becomes symbolic. If you buy a pie at the bakery instead of baking your own, someone wonders aloud why you never learned proper skills. If you do bake your own pie, someone else sighs and says it's a shame no man gets to enjoy it. You can't win. You're either a failure or a waste. Here's a historical truth that smells faintly of mildew and moral panic. The cult of true womanhood was largely crafted and reinforced through popular women's magazines of the era. Godey's Lady's Book was the queen of the genre, full of flowery prose, fashion plates, recipes, and articles about how to be the perfect wife. The women who edited and wrote for these publications weren't all complicit puppets, but their work helped reinforce the narrow ideal of what a good woman looked like. And here's something quirky. While white middle-class women were being held to the ideal of piety and submission, enslaved women and working-class immigrants were excluded from it entirely. The cult didn't care for universality. It was a club with strict dress codes and no concern for real-world complexity. That exclusion created a strange paradox. If you didn't qualify for womanhood in the first place, then you weren't judged by its rules. That left some women freer and others simply ignored. But you fell squarely inside its crosshairs. A white, unmarried, middle-class woman who refuses to conform. That's not just unfortunate, it's unnatural. At least that's what they want you to think. And this is where the debate gets interesting. Some scholars argue that women internalized these ideals and policed each other more harshly than men ever did. That the cult of true womanhood was a self-sustaining ecosystem, where women who bought into the rules became the enforcers. Others say that's too cynical. That women used the script to carve out private power, influence husbands, raise sons to be better, even sneak radical ideas into ladylike pamphlets. The truth is, as always, blurred. Motives mixed. Resistance disguised as etiquette. You pull your shawl tighter as the preacher leans into the part about obedience. Miss Clara shifts next to you. Someone coughs in the back. You wonder how many women in this room are nodding along on the outside while dreaming of something else entirely. Solitude, a bookshop, a lover in secret, or just 1 week of not being watched. You leave the church slowly. Outside, the town is all stone paths and melting snow. You nod to the baker's wife, smile at the pharmacist's daughter, and notice how no one ever asks you how you are, just if you're still teaching, or still at Mrs. Halbert's, or still living alone. The still always carries weight, a polite synonym for stuck. Back at the boarding house, you hang your coat, loosen your stays, and exhale. Miss Lucinda is making coffee in the kitchen, strong and black as sin, and you join her in comfortable silence. The parlour's cold. Someone left the window cracked. You shut it, then pause. The street below is full of men returning from the tavern, laughing loudly, unbothered. You sit. You sip. And you remember a line from one of those old magazines. A woman's highest virtue is to be pleasing in every way. You laugh once, sharp and low. Then you toast your coffee toward the fire and say, "Here's to being a disappointment." It starts with a shawl, a simple thing, hand-stitched, wool-dyed a deep indigo with a pale embroidered border, roses curling like the ones on your wallpaper. It appears one morning on your bed. No note, no fuss. Just folded neatly with a small sprig of lavender tied in twine resting on top. You know who left it, of course. Miss Clara, who spent her evenings pretending to mend while secretly watching everyone in the boarding house like a quiet crow collecting shiny things. You wrap it around your shoulders, grateful and a little embarrassed. You've done the same thing before, slipped a tin of biscuits outside someone's door, lent your only good pair of gloves to a woman heading to the funeral of someone she didn't even like. It's how things work in the shadows of society. When you have no husband, no dowry, and no fixed place in the world, you create your own web of support, not loudly, not even out of obligation, but from necessity, and a strange kind of loyalty born from shared invisibility. There's no safety net for women like you. No one puts your name on a family tree with pride. But you pass things along anyway. A locket, a recipe, a book with pages underlined in pencil. You write each other into existence with hand-me-downs and heirlooms that were never supposed to be yours, and still are. These aren't grand inheritances. You're not talking silver tea sets or dowry chests. These are practical treasures. A well-oiled sewing kit passed from teacher to teacher, a worn Bible with margin notes arguing against half the sermons it's heard, a lace collar that somehow fits every neck. You've received things that wouldn't make it into a museum display but feel weightier than any diamond. A letter from a sister in Georgia, never opened. A pair of scissors engraved with initials no one can quite trace. A pressed flower from someone's almost lover, long gone. One historical fact, tucked behind the parlour clock and forgotten by most. Unmarried women in 19th century America often relied on these informal gift economies to survive. They had no legal right to inherit property in many places, but personal items, clothing, tools, keepsakes, could be quietly passed from hand to hand, forming a lineage that had nothing to do with blood. These small exchanges built networks of care where society offered none. And here's the odd part: quirky, even lovely. Some women made a deliberate choice to bequeath their possessions not to their biological families, but to friends. Close female friendships were often treated as intimate, even sacred. There's a case of two lifelong friends, both single women, who left matching headstones and gave their belongings to one another rather than to the brothers and nephews who never visited. The family protested, of course, but the women's wishes held. You've seen that sort of bond form. In the boarding house, it starts slowly. Someone shares a newspaper clipping. Someone else lends a scarf. Then one night you're both sitting on the floor, splitting a boiled potato and laughing so hard you forget to feel lonely. Before you know it, you've built something that looks suspiciously like family. But you don't call it that. No one would understand. You're just Miss Green and Miss Aldridge, who sometimes walk together, share meals, finish each other's sentences. If you lived in a different time, people might whisper differently. As it is, they just nod and call you good friends. That's where the scholarly debate slides in. Modern historians argue over the language of these relationships. Were they purely platonic, or was there more? Were they coded queer romances, hidden behind needlework and teacups? Or was the emotional intimacy simply a function of a world that gave women no other outlet? Some say these were Boston marriages, long-term domestic partnerships between women who had no need or desire for men. Others caution against reading too much into affection shaped by a completely different social fabric. What's clear is this: the records are scarce, the letters careful, and the truth deeply personal. You remember one letter you were asked to burn. Miss Lucinda gave it to you on a rainy evening, folded and bound with a red ribbon. "Don't read it," she said. "Just see that it disappears." You didn't ask questions. You watched it turn to ash in the fireplace, glowing for just a moment with secrets you'll never know. There's a closeness in this kind of trust, a solidarity. You build your safety from thread and kindness, from whispered warnings about landladies and quiet tips on where to find extra work. You save each other. No one else will. You once met a woman named Mercy who had 6 silver teaspoons and no fixed address. "Every time someone gives me one," she said, "I leave it behind at the next house. That way, the women after me know I passed through and left something behind." You think about that sometimes when you're folding laundry or mending a hem. What will you leave behind? Who will keep your scissors, your shawl, your battered copy of Jane Eyre with the underlined sentence that reads, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me"? The town, of course, does not see these exchanges. It sees only your absence from the record books, your name appearing in census ledgers with no husband beside it, your will, if you're lucky enough to have property, going to a dear friend rather than a son. But those documents miss the real story. They miss the bread you left on someone's doorstep in winter, the stitches you sewed into a friend's dress when she had an interview, the way you all sit together on cold nights passing a single bottle of port like a secret. You wear your new shawl to school the next day. One of the students, a bright-eyed girl with ink smudges on her fingers, says, "You look like a queen." And you smile, not because it's true, but because it's a kind of truth. You're not a queen, you're not a wife, you're not what they told you to be, but you're here, stitched into the lives of women who would have unravelled without you. You never liked embroidery. You can manage a neat stitch, sure, but sitting for hours hunched over linen, coaxing thread into flowers just to decorate the edge of a pillowcase that no one will admire. It feels like painting in invisible ink. But you do it sometimes anyway, because it's one of the few things that make you look busy without drawing suspicion. That and reading. But even reading comes with judgment if you choose the wrong book, which of course you always do. Because truthfully, you prefer newspapers, political columns, classifieds, the occasional scandalous story buried in the back pages under the header "disturbing account." You read them hungrily, ink smudging your fingertips. Not because you plan to run off and join a revolution, but because it feels good to fill your mind with something sharp, something real. For many unmarried women in the 1800s, home-based labour is the thin line between survival and starvation. You know women who make lace until their eyes ache, who take in mending and darning for wealthy families who drop off sacks of clothes without so much as a thank you. Others do millinery work, hats trimmed and fussed over with trembling fingers, and a few, like Miss Clara, manage to sell hand-painted greeting cards through a cousin in Philadelphia. No one makes much, but it's enough to pay for tea, firewood, the occasional ribbon, little luxuries that make poverty feel slightly more dignified. Needlework, ironically, is the least suspicious of all these activities. Society loves a woman with a hoop and thread. It means she's quiet, contained, domestic, proper. It's considered moral labour, something that keeps your hands busy and your soul clean. No one seems to notice that it also pays the rent when your teaching salary runs short. But writing? That's trickier. You've sent a few letters to the editor. Anonymous, of course. Under the name A Curious Observer. One argued against the rising cost of coal. Another gently questioned the mayor's new tax policy. A third, which you never sent, was about women's property rights, written in a tone so fiery you scared yourself. That one's still folded in your desk drawer, wedged under your sewing kit just in case. You've learned to walk a line, engaged but not loud, clever but not threatening. You clip articles about education, mark them with faint pencil stars, and share them with your older students who blink at you with round, curious eyes. Sometimes you read passages aloud, changing the names so the content slips past the moral watchdogs and lands like seeds in young minds. It's a kind of rebellion, a quiet one, a daily whisper against the idea that unmarried women are idle, bored, or broken. Historically, this low hum of activity, needlework, writing, editing, illustrating, formed the backbone of what some historians now call the female shadow economy. You won't find it in the ledgers of city halls or trade reports, but it was everywhere. Women supporting themselves through invisible labour, careful not to seem too successful, because success without a husband was deeply suspicious, almost immoral. And now, for the oddity, some unmarried women, like yourself, became quiet influencers of public opinion, writing letters, poems and articles for religious or political publications under pseudonyms. One woman in New York, known only as G, wrote over 100 editorials for abolitionist journals without ever revealing her identity. Another published short stories about women refusing marriage proposals and living happily alone. Scandalous, sure, but disguised as fiction, which made it palatable. Barely. Of course, there's always the debate. Were these women being subversive, or just carving out space within the cage they were given? Some scholars say they were agents of change, slipping radical ideas into mainstream outlets. Others argue that by playing along, hiding behind initials, making their work appear safe, they reinforce the very systems they hope to critique. You read both sides and decide the truth is probably less noble and more practical. Survival requires compromise. You think of Miss Lucinda, who writes sermons better than the ones you hear at church but will never stand in a pulpit. She reads them to herself in the garden, holding the paper with gloved hands as if the ink might burn her skin. Once, you asked why she didn't publish them. She shrugged. "I don't like the sound of my own name on paper," she said. "It's easier to shout when no one's looking." You get that. And then there are the domestic novels. You borrow them sometimes, reluctantly. The ones with swirling titles like A Heart Divided or Clarissa's Fate. They always end the same way, with a wayward woman finally marrying or dying, preferably both. It's the narrative everyone expects. Your life, however, lacks that neat conclusion. You're the unwritten final chapter, the one no one knows how to shelve. Your parlour becomes your studio, your press, your stage. You write in the early mornings and late evenings, fitting words in between duties like patches in a quilt. Some nights you finish a sentence and sit back, hands ink-stained, surprised by the sound of your own breath in the room. You exist. You have thoughts. You put them into the world, even if the world doesn't know they came from you. One morning, you find a clipping tucked into your doorframe. It's your editorial on school funding printed in full. Someone has underlined your last sentence. A society that neglects its teachers forgets the cost of ignorance. No signature, no message. But you know what it means. Someone read it, someone agreed. It's not applause, but it's something. You spend that afternoon sewing a hem and thinking about how many women before you stitched in silence, while their thoughts danced just out of sight. You imagine all the unwritten essays, the unsent letters, the shredded diaries and burned manuscripts. You feel their ghosts around you, not tragic or bitter, but determined. You are part of a long invisible tradition, a paper trail written in chalk and folded linen and carefully chosen words. You're not idle, you're not voiceless, you're just written in a different ink. You've always been careful with your words, your posture, your gaze. You know what people think of a woman who looks too long at another woman. So you keep your glances brief, polite. You keep your voice calm. And yet, there are moments, small, quiet moments. A glance that lingers 1 second too long. A hand that brushes yours and doesn't pull away. A gift of pressed violets that's explained away as just friendship, even though your heart hammered for 3 days afterward. Tonight you're lying in bed, shawl tucked around your shoulders, the scent of lavender still clinging to it, when you think about that letter from Miss Lucinda, the one you burned. You didn't read it. But you wonder, sometimes, what it said. You think you know, and maybe you're glad you never saw the words, or maybe you regret it more than anything. In the 1800s, there are no words for what you're feeling, not ones people say out loud anyway. There's close companionship, affection, devotion, but never love, not between two women. Not the kind that dares to rise above the teacups and polite conversation. Not the kind you feel. Still, it exists. You've seen it, felt it, lived beside it in the boarding house, even if no one calls it by its name. Miss Clara sleeps with her bedroom door open when Miss Agnes is away, and always closes it tight when she returns. They don't explain. They don't need to. And you've had your own moments. Moments you don't share, not even in your diary. You're not foolish. Paper burns, but not fast enough. The world has decided what women are allowed to want. A husband, a child, a hearth. Anything beyond that is a deviation, a disorder, or, if you're lucky, just ignored. But still, the connections form, in letters passed between friends, in shared glances at the window, in the way someone touches your wrist when passing the sugar bowl, like they're trying to say something without moving their lips. Here's your historical breadcrumb for tonight. The term Boston marriage emerged in the late 19th century to describe long-term, cohabiting relationships between two women who were financially independent and, publicly at least, romantically unattached. The phrase was polite, socially acceptable, and completely saturated with subtext. These women weren't seen as threats. In fact, society often regarded them as quaint, proper, safe. It never occurred to most that something deeper could be taking place behind closed parlour doors. Of course, there are exceptions, a few scandals, a few letters discovered by the wrong brother or burned too late. But most of these partnerships stayed hidden in plain sight, protected by the simple fact that the world refused to imagine two women could love each other like that, a refusal that, ironically, gave some couples a freedom married women could only dream of. But here's the quirky twist. Romantic female friendships weren't just accepted, they were encouraged. Girls wrote each other swooning letters, slept in each other's beds, and braided one another's hair while whispering secrets into the dark. As long as you married a man eventually, no one batted an eye. The moment you didn't, those sweet gestures started to look suspicious. That's when the whispering began. You've kept a few letters, hidden carefully between the pages of a book no one ever borrows from the town library. A treatise on soil composition in the New England states. Absolutely no one's checking that out. Inside are folded pieces of paper worn soft at the edges. One is from a girl you knew when you were 16. Another from a woman you met at a teacher's conference, who smelled like pine and ink and held your gaze just a little too long. You never wrote back. You didn't trust the postmaster, but you kept the letter. Because sometimes a thing doesn't need to be answered to matter. This is where modern scholars walk carefully. Some believe these relationships were romantic, coded in language and circumstance. Others argue it's anachronistic to project modern ideas onto women who lived in a different social universe. But when you read the letters, my dearest, my heart aches in your absence. I long to see your face again. You know, you don't need an expert to tell you what longing looks like. Not all unmarried women felt this. Many truly didn't need or want love in that way from anyone. But for those who did, and found it not in the arms of a husband but in the steady presence of another woman, the world had no script. You had to write your own, in glances, in favours, in the absence of explanation. Sometimes, when you're sitting on the back steps with Lucinda and the moon is high, you catch her watching you like she's trying to read a story on your face. You never ask what she sees. You don't have to. You offer her the last of the brandy instead, and the two of you sit in companionable silence, your shoulders nearly touching, never quite touching, the distance between you filled with 1,000 unspoken things. You wonder occasionally what might have happened if you'd lived in another time, one with words for what you feel, one where you could write her a letter and sign it with your real name, where you could walk beside her in the market and not pretend you were only buying flour, where she could take your hand without someone raising an eyebrow. But that world isn't here, so instead you do what women like you have always done. You live in the margins, you love quietly, you carry your secrets like heirlooms, fragile and precious. And when you close your eyes at night you replay the sound of her voice, the way it softened when she said your name. That somehow is enough. You pack light, just one satchel, a book of essays, and your good boots. There's no fanfare, no farewell parade. You slip out just after breakfast, leaving a note for the landlady, and a jar of cherry preserves for Miss Clara, who's still asleep in the room across the hall. The train station smells like coal dust and last-minute regrets. You stand on the platform trying to remember if you packed enough handkerchiefs, or if you even care. You're heading west. Not forever, just for a while. A cousin, twice removed and barely remembered, has written from Colorado territory. There's work here, she says, and not enough women to judge you. It's a funny way to put it, but it makes your chest tighten in a good way. You've never been west of Ohio. You've barely been out of your own zip code, if such a thing had existed. But now, at 36, with a tidy bank envelope and a tired soul, you've decided to see what all this open land actually looks like. The train lurches forward. You don't wave. No one's watching. By the 1850s and beyond, this journey, east to west, was something of a quiet migration for women who didn't fit the mould. Frontier towns had shortages of nearly everything: lumber, lawmen, good manners, and women, especially white women. So a single lady travelling west wasn't strange, it was useful. The odds of marriage improved the further west you went. There were towns where the ratio of men to women was 10 to 1. A spinster could become a sought-after novelty overnight. But you're not here to get married. You're here to breathe. The journey is long, full of rattling windows and boiled eggs wrapped in newspaper. You keep mostly to yourself, although a kind man named Elijah insists on telling you about his cows until you fake sleep. At night you curl into the corner of your seat, scarf pulled over your face, dreaming of endless sky and dirt roads that go nowhere. When you arrive, it's not quite what you imagined. There's more mud. The buildings look like they've been assembled by drunk carpenters. Dust clings to everything, including your boots before you've even stepped fully off the train. But there's something else too, a looseness, a freedom in the way people walk, the way they look you over without the same quiet calculation you're used to back east. You find a room above a butcher shop. It smells like salt and smoke, but the rent is cheap, and the widow who owns it winks when she tells you not to ask questions after dark. You nod. You've already learned the language of things not said. Work isn't hard to find. You begin helping at a tiny one-room schoolhouse where half the students don't own shoes, and the other half can't spell shoelace. It's messy, loud, chaotic, but there's joy in it. You're called Miss East by everyone, which you find oddly endearing. When someone forgets your real name, you don't correct them. Here's your historical truth for tonight. As the American frontier expanded, many unmarried women travelled west to work as teachers, governesses, nurses, or in some cases, homesteaders. Under the Homestead Act of 1862, single women could even claim land in their own names, something often impossible back east. It wasn't easy. It wasn't glamorous. But it was legal. That was a revolution in boots and a sunbonnet. And here's something more peculiar. Frontier towns, for all their lawlessness, often offered more social mobility to single women. partly because there were fewer people around to enforce expectations, and partly because survival trumped etiquette. No one cared if you didn't embroider. They cared if you could shoot straight, teach arithmetic, or survive a snowstorm. Women who would have been dismissed as old maids back home suddenly found themselves in positions of authority, even admiration. You feel it, that shift. Back east you were Miss Cartwright, unmarried. Here you're Miss Cartwright who got the Miller boy to read without crying. Back home you were an extra guest at dinner. Here you're invited to help judge the county pie contest and no one says a word about your lack of a ring. It's not that judgment disappears, it just becomes less important than the business of staying warm, fed and alive. Of course, freedom has its price. You're lonely. The nights are darker out here. There's no Lucinda to split a drink with. No Clara humming in the next room. You write letters you never send. You reread the same book 3 times. Some nights, coyotes cry in the distance, and it feels like someone mourning something you almost remember. But then there are mornings. Mornings when the sky opens like a clean page, and the whole world smells like pine and wind and whatever else God forgot to name. You walk to the schoolhouse past women hauling water and men hauling regrets. No one watches you too closely. No one asks why you're alone. There's a woman here named Josephine. She runs the apothecary. You like the way she talks, slow and low, like she's used to being ignored and doesn't care. One afternoon she lets you borrow a book of poetry without asking your name. The next day you return it with a slip of paper between the pages, a note about the final stanza. She doesn't reply, but the next time you stop in she hands you a jar of homemade balm and says, "Thought you might need this." Your hand lingers on hers for a breath too long, she lets it. You don't know what this place is becoming. Maybe it's just a chapter. Maybe it's a turning point. Maybe it's just the first place you've ever lived where being unmarried doesn't feel like a label. All you know is this. Out here, you are allowed to exist as yourself. Not as someone's sister, daughter, or disappointing cousin. Just as a woman, a teacher, a person with dust on her boots and ink on her fingers. And for now, that's more than enough. The bell rings at 5 in the morning. Not the gentle chime of a schoolhouse triangle, but the jarring, metallic clang of a factory shift change. You're not in Colorado anymore. Not in your tidy classroom with chalk dust and pine air. This time, we're heading somewhere else entirely. Into the noise, the sweat, and the smoke of industrial America, where single women don't sip tea in boarding houses. They clock in. You're standing outside a textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts. It's 1848, and you're 17, or maybe 22. Your parents needed your wages, or you needed to get out. Either way, you're here, bundled against the cold, hair pinned back tightly, a small tin pail swinging from your wrist. Around you, dozens of other women gather, some barely past girlhood, others with the set jaw of survival carved deep. You nod to each other. There's no time for more than that. This is life as a mill girl. You work 13 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sunday is your only escape, and even that's expected to involve church and rest, not rebellion. Your job? Operating the looms. The factory floor is hot, air thick with cotton dust. The machines scream louder than you thought possible, and you quickly learn to read lips and use hand signals. The foreman doesn't like noise unless it comes from production. It's not glamorous, but it's yours, your labour. Your wages, though modest, go to rent, food, and sometimes back home to your family, who write letters asking why you haven't married yet. You crumple those parts before reading the rest. Life in the factory towns is fast. Women live 5 or 6 to a boarding house, beds narrow, windows greasy with soot. You read by candlelight and wash your clothes in icy water from a shared pump. At night, you rub liniment into your wrists, your shoulders, your aching lower back. Then you do it all again. But here's the thing they don't expect. You're not broken. You're alive. Loud, even. You attend lectures. You read newspapers. You talk politics over soup. You organise. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. The mill girls of Lowell and other factory towns weren't just labourers. They became some of the earliest labour organisers in the country. In the 1830s and 1840s, groups of single working women led strikes called turnouts, protesting wage cuts, boarding fee hikes, and inhumane hours. They risked their jobs and reputations to demand better. The press mocked them, of course, called them hysterical, ungrateful, but they kept marching. It's easy to forget, but these were women society expected to be quiet, moral, grateful. Instead, they stood in the streets shouting, not for husbands, for dignity. Here's a quirky detail you'll love. Many mill girls published poems and essays in factory-funded newsletters like the Lowell Offering. These weren't just diary entries, they were political, philosophical, and laced with biting humour. Some women adopted pen names, others didn't bother. They wanted their names in print. Why not? They earned it. You imagine yourself writing after a long shift, hands raw, eyes tired, still scribbling on the back of an invoice or a flour sack. Let them say I should have married, you write, but I would rather have calluses than silence. Back in the boarding house, you share a room with 4 women, each with her own story, her own reason for being here. One keeps a picture of a man in a locket but never talks about him. Another dreams of opening a bakery and practices recipes in secret. A third has a cough that won't go away, and every time she turns toward the wall, you feel a stab of worry you can't name. There's a strange kind of sisterhood here. It's not gentle. It's forged in noise and exhaustion, in the tiny kindnesses that make life livable. Sharing apples, hemming each other's sleeves, braiding someone's hair on Sunday morning just to feel human again. But it's also unstable. If you complain too loudly or organise too effectively, you can be replaced. There's always someone poorer, more desperate. That tension hums under everything. This leads to a heated debate among scholars. Were these women exploited or empowered? The obvious answer is both. They were underpaid and overworked. Yes. But they also carved out a space to live independently, earn wages, and assert opinions in a society that treated most unmarried women like decorative wallpaper. These factory jobs, harsh as they were, opened a door. You walk to work one morning, frost on your scarf, and hear a girl humming beside you. She's new, 16 maybe. She doesn't know the foreman yells for no reason, or that you should always hide your best socks in the foot of the bed. You tell her gently. She smiles like you've just given her a secret code. You have. Survival is made of small shared strategies. You still dream now and then of something else. A small bookstore, a garden, even a quiet marriage. Though you're not sure what that would look like. Not with any man you've ever met. But those are thoughts for Sundays. Today is for your body, your endurance, your capacity to keep going. You go to sleep with threads tangled in your hair. You dream of turning wheels, of long corridors lit by oil lamps, of women's voices rising like steam in the winter air. Tired, sharp, determined. Voices like yours, and when you wake up the machines are waiting. But so are you. The advertisement reads like a promise and a prayer all in one. Lonely gentleman of serious temperament seeks female companionship. Must be of strong character and pure heart. Widower preferred. Please respond with likeness. You stare at the clipping, half amused, half curious, and fully aware that you're about to do something slightly ridiculous. You reach for your writing paper. You've never met this man, never heard of him. You don't know if he's honest or utterly deluded, but it's 1871, and the town is small, the boarding house colder than usual, and you're tired of being everyone's ghost. So you answer, politely, cautiously, without your real name. You sign the letter Miss M. This is the world of 19th century matrimonial ads, an odd little theatre of hope, desperation, reinvention, and sometimes outright lies. Think of it as the Tinder of the 1800s, except slower, with more decorative penmanship and a significantly higher chance of tuberculosis. You're not the only one. Thousands of unmarried women, especially those labelled spinsters, turn to these ads. Some were sincere in their search for companionship. Others were curious. A few were out to scam or mock the system entirely. You're somewhere in the middle, nibbling the end of your pen and wondering if it's wrong to describe yourself as a woman of natural disposition and quiet tastes, when, really, you once smuggled a flask into a Christmas service. Your letter takes 3 days to mail and a week to receive a reply. When it arrives, it's overly formal, oddly charming, and signed Mr. A. You write back, partly out of politeness, partly because his letter made you laugh, and partly because, if you're being honest, you haven't flirted with anyone in so long your skills have started to rust. The correspondence builds slowly. Nothing racy, of course. It's the 1800s, not a scandal sheet. But still you find yourself waiting for the mail. You try not to smooth your hair before opening each envelope, but you do anyway. Here's your historical gem. Matrimonial advertisements exploded in popularity in the mid to late 19th century, especially after the Civil War, which left a generation of women facing a lopsided marriage market. So many men had died or come back broken, and many women, especially in rural areas, had little chance of meeting eligible suitors. The newspaper ad became a strange sort of lifeline, a paper bridge between strangers. But it wasn't always about marriage. Sometimes the ads were a smokescreen for other kinds of arrangements, business partnerships, companionship, even, scandalously, romance outside the bounds of matrimony. In some cases, women placed the ads themselves. That was rare, and often met with ridicule or suspicion, but it happened. One ad simply read, "Independent woman, not young but not dead, seeks man with patience, teeth, and no strong opinions on soup." You keep that one folded in your diary for courage. The quirky detail. Some newspapers had entire pages devoted to matrimonials. Editors would run side columns with commentary, sometimes praising a particularly poetic ad, sometimes mocking the more desperate ones. It became a sort of social soap opera, especially in towns where everyone was pretending not to read but absolutely reading. As for your Mr. A, you exchange 6 letters over 6 weeks. You learn he keeps bees, likes the poetry of Byron, and once tried to cook a chicken over an open flame and set his barn door on fire. You laugh more than you should. You imagine what he looks like. You invent his voice in your head. You know it can't lead anywhere. You live hundreds of miles apart. He probably wants a wife, a housekeeper, maybe even children, and you've already closed that chapter in your mind, if it was ever open at all, but still. The letters arrive, and your days feel less grey. One morning, he writes, "Would you ever consider coming to visit?" And your stomach drops. Not because you're afraid, but because you're not sure if you should answer. What would that look like? Travelling to meet a man you've never seen, at your age, as a single woman? This is where the debate sparks. Did matrimonial ads empower women by giving them agency in choosing a partner, or did they just extend the same expectations of marriage into a new medium? Some scholars say women used these columns to take control of their destinies, escape small towns, and reinvent themselves. Others argue it was just another arena where women were judged by youth, beauty, and their ability to cook stew without weeping. You never go, you write Mr. A kind letter, carefully worded, gently evasive, and stop answering after that. Not because you didn't like him. You did. But because something about the distance, the anonymity, made it feel like a dream. Real life requires more than charming handwriting. It requires space, and your space, for better or worse, is solitary. You still think about him sometimes. Wonder if he married someone else. If he ever got that new hive he mentioned. If he kept your letters. You kept his. Not all of them. Just one. The one that ends with, "Even if I never meet you, I will remember you with fondness, like a song I once heard on a warm night and never found again." You fold it carefully and slip it back into the drawer. The boarding house smells like biscuits. Miss Clara is humming again. Lucinda has left a fresh pair of gloves on your bed. Yours had holes in the fingers. Life continues in its quiet orbit. You stir sugar into your tea and imagine what you might write in an ad of your own. Unmarried woman, opinionated, fond of poetry, firelight, and never apologising. Looking for something. Not sure what. Surprise me. You smile, tear up the paper and toss it in the stove. Some things are best left unwritten. The church bells toll again, this time slower. A different tone, one reserved for processions and partings. A neighbour has died. Not someone you knew well, but well enough to have passed her in the bakery or nodded to her on market days. You attend the service out of respect, your black shawl pinned carefully, boots polished, gloves folded over your hands like a habit. The room smells of old wood, flowers and polite grief. Someone sobs once briefly, then falls silent. It's what's expected. Afterward you walk home slower than usual. You can't shake the feeling that this could have been you. That, really, it still could be. Alone, forgotten. Mourned with 2 lines in the church newsletter and a pie brought to your landlady out of assumed duty. It's not morbid, it's practical. When you're an unmarried woman in the 1800s, you're always 2 steps from the margins, unless you find a way to take up space. And some women did. Some walked boldly into that space and claimed it, not as wives, not as mothers, but as caretakers of the sick, guardians of the soul, or servants of the public good. They became nuns, nurses, midwives, hospital matrons, charitable workers. Some even ran entire institutions without ever putting on a wedding ring. You consider this as you walk past the old stone chapel just outside town. It's a Catholic building, small, ivy-clad, oddly quiet. You're not Catholic yourself, but you know who lives there. The Sisters of Mercy. They arrived a few years back, moving like shadows in their black habits, steady and composed, and quickly took over care for the poor, the infirm, and the children no one else claimed. You've watched them from a distance, silent processions, laundry hung in neat lines, the steady rhythm of a life that has no room for vanity or frivolity. It both terrifies and fascinates you. Some of those women came to the order after losing everything. Others joined young, full of fervour. A few, you suspect, came because it offered something they couldn't find anywhere else. Safety, structure, and a community that wouldn't ask why they never married. Being a nun isn't just a religious calling in the 19th century, it's a survival strategy. An unmarried woman can starve, be slandered, or simply vanish into obscurity. But a nun wears purpose like a shield. Her title is fixed, her role respected if not always understood. She may never own property or choose her meals, but she's not a ghost. She's Sister Margaret, Sister Clara. She is someone. And then there are the nurses. The Civil War, bloody and indiscriminate, cracked open a space for women to serve without apology. Single women, especially, flooded into field hospitals, tending to shattered bodies and fevers that burned through tents like wildfire. It was brutal work, undignified, dangerous, but it was work that needed doing, and it didn't require a husband's permission. Here's your historical fact for tonight. By the end of the Civil War, thousands of women had served as nurses, many of them unmarried, and in their 30s or older. Clara Barton, who later founded the American Red Cross, was unmarried her entire life. Dorothea Dix, who reformed mental asylums, the same. These women didn't miss out on marriage. They bypassed it, deliberately or circumstantially, to do something else, something big. But there's a twist, quirky even. Public trust in nurses wasn't immediate. At the war's onset, many considered it unfeminine for women to care for strange men's bodies. The idea of single women handling wounds, seeing blood, hearing soldiers curse, scandalous. Some hospitals even banned unmarried nurses at first, fearing for their reputations. Eventually, practicality won out. The war didn't care about etiquette. It needed hands. That's the strange blessing of crisis. It makes room for women to exist outside the usual scripts. As long as you're useful, people stop asking questions. Still, there's the question scholars return to over and over. Were these paths, nursing, religious life, charity, truly empowering? Or were they just other forms of acceptable female self-sacrifice? You trade one cage for another. You're no longer a wife, but you're still defined by service, still expected to give everything and ask for nothing. The difference is that sometimes you choose the cage yourself. You stop by the chapel gate. The ivy's curling up the wall like it's trying to listen in. One of the sisters is sweeping the steps, and for a moment she glances up at you. Just a moment. And there's a flicker of recognition. Not familiarity, but understanding, like she sees what you could have been, or what you still might become. You nod. She nods back. No words. No need. Later that night you find yourself sitting in your room with a blank sheet of paper. You write a list. Things I could still do. You add open a school, go west again, learn medicine, join a convent. Then you cross out the last one, not because you couldn't, but because the idea makes your stomach twist in a way you don't understand. It's not fear, it's something else. The price of erasing your name to become sister someone else feels steep. Still, there's a kind of envy. Those women in black, unburdened by expectations, walking into deathbeds and poverty with calm eyes and firm hands. They're unmarried. But no one calls them spinsters. They're not judged. They're needed. You fold the paper and tuck it into the back of your Bible. It's a maybe, a possibility. You're not ready yet. But it's good to know there are still options. You curl up in bed, candle sputtering low, and think about all the women who gave their lives to service, not because they were pious or perfect, but because it gave them a way to move through the world without apology, a way to matter. You fall asleep with that thought tucked in beside you like an extra quilt. You do not need a husband to be essential. The coffee is burnt, the stew is watery, and someone forgot to patch the window again, so the cold whistles through the parlour like it's got something to say. But no one here is complaining. Not really, because tonight's the meeting, and every woman in the room is exactly where she wants to be. This isn't a church circle or a quilting bee. It's something stranger, looser, louder. You're sitting in a drafty room full of unmarried women who have, in one way or another, dropped out of polite society and somehow found each other. This is a commune, or at least something that calls itself one. The year is 1855, and you've come to stay, temporarily you insist, at a curious little settlement in upstate New York called Harmony Vale. You found it through a pamphlet left on a train bench, the headline promising peace, purpose, and shared property. You weren't looking for peace necessarily, but the idea of shared property piqued your interest. Harmony Vale is run by a woman named Annis. No last name, thank you. She wears trousers under her skirts and calls everyone comrade with a completely straight face. She reads Emerson, eats raw garlic for her health, and has zero tolerance for what she calls parlour morality. You kind of adore her. The community consists of 12 people, 8 of whom are women, 6 of whom are unmarried. One says she was once a governess in Philadelphia, but refuses to elaborate. Another claims to be a widow, though you're almost certain her late husband was fictional. They grow vegetables, raise goats, and trade embroidery for books with a nearby town. No one owns anything outright, and no one is allowed to apologise for existing. It's chaos, it's heaven, and it's not as rare as you thought. By the mid-1800s, the United States had become a patchwork of experimental communities, places where people sought to reinvent society from the ground up. Many of these were utopian in nature, and more than a few welcomed or were founded by single women. Shakers, Fourierists, perfectionists, spiritualists, names that sound made up but were as real as your boarding house back east. Here's your historical fact. Between 1820 and 1860, over 80 utopian communities sprang up across America. Some promised religious purity, others offered sexual liberation. Still others, like the one you're currently sipping herbal tea in, just promised no one would ask when you planned to marry. Women, especially unmarried women, were often drawn to these spaces. Why? Because they offered a way out, a way around the marriage track, a way into ownership, voice, purpose, or simply peace. These communities had their flaws, God did they. But for a while they held something radical, the idea that a woman's value wasn't tied to her marital status or womb. Tonight's discussion is about property. Annis argues that land should be held in common, and anyone caught nesting too personally, placing lace doilies, labelling cupboards, is called out with affectionate ridicule. You stay quiet, then offer a suggestion about rotating bed chores, and everyone nods like you've just redefined democracy. It's deeply validating. It's also deeply odd. You haven't spoken this freely in years, and here's your quirky twist of the evening. In some communities, women held more power than men, not just symbolically, but structurally. The Shakers, for example, practiced celibacy. Yes, celibacy. And organised themselves in male-female leadership pairs, with women often outlasting their male counterparts. Other groups allowed women to speak in meetings, vote on issues, and even dictate religious doctrine. Radical stuff for a world that still thinks women's brains might wilt under too much reasoning. Still, not everyone outside thinks fondly of places like Harmony Vale. In town, they call it that scandal camp. They assume orgies, or witchcraft, or communism, which, to be fair, isn't entirely inaccurate. People don't like what they don't understand, especially when it doesn't bend politely to their expectations. Even within, tensions rise. Not everyone agrees on how shared is too shared, whether love should be monogamous, seasonal, or forbidden entirely, whether goats should be allowed in the dining hall. But for now, you belong. You wake up with purpose. You sleep without apologies. You write in your journal with the windows open, even when it's snowing. The debate among scholars is predictable. Were these communities empowering sanctuaries or chaotic distractions? Did they offer real alternatives to patriarchy, or just new hierarchies in disguise? Some say they allowed women to flourish. Others point out that most of them collapsed within a few decades, often due to money trouble, doctrinal disputes, or someone running off with someone else's lover. That last one happens more than you'd think. Your favourite part of the day is the evening meal. Everyone sits together, elbow to elbow, eating lentils and arguing philosophy. The fire crackles. Someone's always strumming something badly in the corner, and no one, not once, asks if you miss being a wife. One night, as you clean dishes with a woman named Eliza, tall, freckled, a voice like tree bark, she asks quietly, "Did you come here to start over, or just to hide?" You don't answer right away. She doesn't press. Later she slips you a note. Either way, I'm glad you're here. You tuck it into your coat pocket. It stays there for years. And when you finally leave Harmony Vale, a year later, boots worn through, heart oddly full, you don't leave bitter or jaded. You leave with the knowledge that somewhere, someone built a room where you could speak freely, laugh loudly, and forget, if only for a moment, that you were ever out of place. You head back into the world different, not married, not reformed, but clearer, braver, and just a little bit wilder. The first thing you notice is her hat, wide-brimmed, slightly askew, a peacock feather tilted like a dare. The second thing you notice is her walk, upright, steady, like she's used to watching her back but never lets it slow her down. Her name is Miss Loretta Parker, and when she shakes your hand, her grip is firm, her nails are clean, and her eyes flick up and down your coat with a quick practice sweep. She's the kind of woman who doesn't ask for introductions, she just is. You meet her on the steps of a church in Richmond. You're there as a volunteer, helping catalogue donated books for a new freed people's school. She's there to run the place. You didn't expect that. It's 1873 and the war is over, technically. The nation has been sewn back together with uneven stitches and threads still unravelling. But nothing about life is truly back to normal, especially not for the black women stepping into freedom with centuries of weight pressing behind them, and entire societies trying to shove them back down. Miss Parker is a freeborn black woman in her late 30s, never married, never even close, she says with a smirk. She's lived in Philadelphia, Charleston, and now Richmond. You get the sense she's always moving forward, even when standing still. She speaks like she's trying to make up for all the time others wasted doubting her. You've come across 100 unmarried women in your life, but never one like her. She doesn't apologise, doesn't shrink, and she tells you, within 10 minutes of meeting you, that freedom has made her twice as ambitious and half as patient. Single black women in the decades after emancipation live in a reality that's both parallel to and entirely different from your own. While white women without husbands are viewed as curious, pitiable, sometimes even scandalous, single black women carry additional layers, racial scrutiny, economic danger, and a constant pressure to prove their respectability. Some seek it in marriage, others like Loretta reject the whole notion. She teaches by day, organises literacy classes by night, and on Sundays she stands in the back of the church with her arms crossed, evaluating the sermon like a school inspector. People talk, of course. They always do. Some admire her, others mutter that she's too proud, too direct, too much. She knows. She doesn't care. Here's your historical foundation. After the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of formerly enslaved people were suddenly, stunningly free. But freedom didn't come with instruction manuals or financial security. Many freed black women, especially those who remained unmarried, built their own paths as laundresses, midwives, seamstresses, and more quietly organisers of their communities. They carved out space where none existed, often pooling resources with other women, sometimes relatives, sometimes not, to survive and thrive. And here's the peculiar detail. While white society often encouraged its women to marry early and become domestic angels, many black women during this era, especially in cities, found that marriage could complicate their newly won autonomy. A husband, even a good one, could unintentionally reintroduce forms of control they had only just escaped. So some chose instead to remain single, to work, to lead, to live on their own terms. You watch Loretta manage a classroom of 30 students like she's commanding an army. Calm, clear, no wasted motion. You're asked to assist her one day, and she hands you a stack of primers with a glance that says, "Don't fall behind." You don't. In the evenings, she invites you to tea. Her home is modest but orderly. Photographs on the mantel, a plant in the window that's clearly pampered. You drink from mismatched cups and listen to her talk about her plans. Another school in Norfolk, maybe a print shop next year. She's already found the space. You ask her once if she ever wanted to marry. She laughs. "I've wanted to dance, I've wanted to build a library, I've wanted to out-debate every man in this city. Marriage?" She shrugs. Never seemed urgent. The debate among historians is nuanced. Did black unmarried women in postbellum America remain single by choice, or were they constrained by economic hardship, systemic racism, and the trauma of disrupted families? The answer, of course, is yes, to all of it. But that doesn't erase the agency of women like Loretta, who actively chose solitude and leadership over domesticity and obedience. There's still danger, though. Every black woman who lives alone in this era walks with risk: housing discrimination, street harassment, the ever-present threat of being labelled a loose woman. Loretta once had a brick thrown through her school window. Another time, a man cornered her in the alley behind the grocer and told her she'd be prettier if she smiled more. She gave him a look so sharp he left limping. You don't ask for details. You spend 3 months helping at the school. During that time you learn more about dignity than you ever have in your life. Loretta doesn't hide her anger. She names it, uses it, burns it for fuel. One day, she catches you hesitating before scolding a boy for stealing chalk. She pulls you aside and says, "Don't go soft just because you feel sorry. We don't have time for that." And you understand. When you finally leave, she gives you a hug. A real one. Arms strong, heart steady. "You're tougher than you look," she says, smiling with just her eyes. "Go prove it." You board the train with her voice in your ear, her cup in your satchel, a parting gift, chipped and beloved. You think of her often, when someone underestimates you, when someone talks over you, when someone asks, "Why didn't you ever marry?" as if that's the only story worth telling. You think of Loretta Parker, proud, unmarried, unbothered, and utterly unforgettable. It's a summer afternoon thick with dust and buzzing flies when you arrive in Indian territory, your skirt sticking to your knees and the back of your neck sunburned through your bonnet. You're tired, but more than that, you're out of place. The landscape sprawls wide and strange, all red earth and wind-shaped trees so unlike the clipped hedges and brick sidewalks of the towns you've known. The air smells of cedar smoke and damp leather. There's a quiet here that feels deeper than silence. You're here to visit your cousin, Sarah, who married into the Cherokee Nation a decade ago. Her letters arrive twice a year, folded neat, smelling faintly of tobacco and pine. She signs them Sally now. You've always wondered if that was a nickname she chose or one that was given to her. Either way, she seems different, bolder, her script wider, her tone harder to read. She meets you in a wagon drawn by a mule with one good eye and a constant sneeze. She's wearing a tunic and trousers under her skirt, and you realise in an instant she's not the same girl who used to cry over spilled ink at boarding school. She lifts your trunk like it weighs nothing and says, "You'll need sturdier shoes." Sally doesn't ask if you're married. She doesn't explain her living arrangements. She just points out where the sun sets and says you'll share a room with her daughter, who's currently off, climbing something she shouldn't be. The house is small, clean, filled with woven baskets and heavy books. You spot no wedding photo, no ring, and no apologies. This isn't the America you're used to. And the rules for women here, especially unmarried ones, aren't quite the same either. Among many indigenous nations, women held far different roles than white society allowed. In some tribes, women owned property, controlled marriage and divorce, even held positions of authority. And while colonization, forced relocation, and assimilation campaigns did their best to dismantle these systems, echoes remained. In some corners of native life, an unmarried woman wasn't a failure or an anomaly. She was simply herself. You ask Sally about it one evening as you shell beans on the porch. She shrugs. "We have words for women who don't marry," she says. "They're usually not insults." She tells you how, in Cherokee tradition, women used to live matrilineally. Families followed the mother's line. Land passed through the women. Children belonged to their mother's clan. If a man became violent or useless, a woman could simply put his things outside. No formal divorce, no priest, just a clean start. But the missionaries hated that, she adds with a smirk. Said it was immoral, too easy. And here's your historical fact. Prior to European contact, many native societies, including the Cherokee, Iroquois and Hopi, offered women roles of status and independence that sharply contrasted with the European model. Matrilineal inheritance, political councils, agricultural control, women weren't just helpmeets, they were cornerstones. Colonizers, of course, found this threatening, and so came the schools, the Bibles, the forced gender roles. Bit by bit, the system shifted, but not entirely. Sally knows the new laws, she's read the treaties. She understands that women's roles have been rewritten and whitewashed. They want us to be wives first, she says, then mothers, then silent. It's not how it's supposed to be. There's a woman in the settlement named Anyehi, older, unmarried, respected by everyone. She gathers herbs, delivers babies, gives advice you don't ask for but always need. The men defer to her. Not because she demands it, but because she knows things. You ask Sally what Nanyehi does for a living, she laughs. She lives, she says. That's her job. You begin to notice the rhythm of this place. Women speaking plainly, men listening, or at least pretending to. Girls running barefoot, shouting, never once told to be quiet. There's still judgment. Some, especially from those who've adopted the white ways. but it doesn't hold the same weight here. An unmarried woman might be peculiar. She might be strong, but she's not broken. Still, it's not simple. The US government is pushing policies that reshape native life, carving up land into private plots, pressuring families into legal marriages, Christian names, patriarchal households. The tension between tradition and survival runs through everything. You talk with Sally late one night, sitting cross-legged on a rug made of woven river reeds. The oil lamp flickers. Some women marry because they want to, she says. Some marry because they're told it's the only way to be safe. And some of us, well, we just don't. The scholars argue, of course, was the autonomy of native women truly preserved after contact, or was it mostly destroyed by colonial pressures? Did unmarried Indigenous women retain cultural power, or were they pushed into invisibility? The answer shifts depending on the tribe, the time, the place. But the thread is clear. Their stories were rewritten, often erased, often rebranded to fit a white narrative of what womanhood should be. But you're here now, listening, watching, learning. On your final day, you help Sally repair a fence. She works faster than you, sweat on her brow, sleeves rolled high. She says, "You look different, not softer, just less folded." You don't know exactly what she means, but you feel it. Something has unfurled inside you. A certainty, maybe. A stubbornness that doesn't apologize anymore. You leave with your satchel, heavier than when you arrived. Book Sally pressed into your hands, herbs Nanyehi insisted you take. A scrap of fabric embroidered with the word, enough. You tuck it into your pocket. You head east again, boots dust-covered, skin browned by sun, and more aware than ever that the world is bigger than the path you were told to follow. That there are women who have carved their own way for centuries with no permission asked, and you think, if there's a place where a woman's worth isn't measured by a ring, a womb, or a surname, then maybe, just maybe, that place isn't a dream. Maybe it's just been waiting for you to see it. You've never been in a desert before. The light here is too big, the sky too loud. It flattens you, scrapes away your usual edges. Dust creeps into your boots, your hair, even your teeth. You're squinting through it when you first see the town. Low-slung buildings, wide dirt roads, and a tall wooden structure at the centre that could be a church or a gallows. Hard to say from a distance. A stagecoach rattles past, and someone tips their hat to you out of habit or curiosity. You've come to Utah Territory, specifically to Salt Lake City. The year is 1879, and you're here to visit an old friend, Emmeline, who, as it turns out, is married. Not just married, plural married. She's a Mormon wife, and you've arrived in the belly of one of America's most misunderstood and controversial social experiments, polygamy. You haven't seen Emmeline in years, not since you taught together in Cincinnati. She was always the sweet one, the one who believed in order and clean slates and redemption in every form. Now she's someone's third wife, living in a large, spare house with 2 other women and a man you never quite see clearly. He passes in and out like a shadow. It's the women who rule the space. They don't seem bitter. They don't even seem especially devoted to him. It's stranger than that. Calmer. You stay in a spare room, mostly to satisfy your curiosity and perhaps to challenge your assumptions. Because while you've spent your whole life dodging marriage, here's a group of women who've leaned into it hard, and not just as wives, but as sister wives. It's complicated, and it doesn't take long before you realise that being single here carries a whole different kind of weight. In Mormon culture, especially in the 19th century, marriage isn't just expected, it's doctrinal, it's eternal. Women are taught that to be unmarried is not just lonely, but spiritually dangerous. Plural marriage was introduced in secret by Joseph Smith, and expanded by Brigham Young as part of a divine order. In theory, it elevated women by protecting them, giving them roles in heavenly architecture. In practice, it created a society where unmarried women were anomalies, or warnings. You ask Emmeline what happens to women who don't marry here. She hesitates. They join someone's household, usually. Or they move east, or they disappear a little. She doesn't mean physically, she means in the eyes of the community. To be single is to be outside the spiritual contract. You're tolerated, not embraced. You attend a women's meeting with Emmeline. It's not what you expected. No gloom, no resentful glances across the room. The women are sewing and laughing, babies on laps, bread rising in pans by the fire. It's loud, domestic, bustling. Yet under the surface you sense a tightness. The roles are clearly marked. There's little room for deviation. Later, another wife, Rosina, sits beside you during tea. She asks why you've never married. You start your usual answer, the one about being busy or picky, but she stops you. You don't have to explain, she says. Not here. You're just different. You're not sure if it's kindness or pity, maybe both. And here's your historical nugget. In the 19th century, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints practiced polygamy openly for decades, creating a complex web of domestic arrangements. While often seen as oppressive to women, many Mormon women defended the practice, citing sisterhood, security, and spiritual obedience. Some even held leadership roles, published periodicals, and advocated for women's rights, including suffrage, within the structure of plural marriage. The quirk? Mormon women were some of the earliest in the country to vote. Utah women gained suffrage in 1870, long before most others. The irony was thick. Polygamous wives voting for legislators in a system that didn't trust them to be full citizens unless they were monogamous. Emmeline voted last year, she tells you proudly. He didn't tell me who to choose, she says, sipping tea. He knows better. Still, the federal government is tightening its grip. The anti-polygamy laws are growing teeth. Edmunds Act, Edmunds-Tucker Act. More on the horizon. Some women are fleeing underground, others are splitting from the church, and unmarried women? They face choices even harder to explain. There's a woman you meet at the market named Miriam. No husband, no children. She lives alone at the edge of the valley and sells herbs and tinctures that make the bishop's wives nervous. She says little. People call her peculiar, which is territory you know well. But when she talks to you, it's like a mirror being held up. You see in her a different version of yourself, one shaped by doctrine and desert, but still herself, still free. One evening, walking home under a pink sky, Emmeline says, "Some of us chose this, not because we love the man, but because we love each other. It's not what you think." You nod, you believe her. But you also know that for every woman who finds community in this system, there's another who suffocates under it. The scholars debate endlessly. Was polygamy liberating or confining? Did it give women autonomy within structure, or just wrap their cages in ribbon and scripture? There's no easy answer. The lived experience was as varied as the women inside it. You leave Salt Lake quietly just as you arrived. Emmeline presses a wrapped bundle into your hand, a hand-sewn pouch of dried sage and a note that says simply, "You'll find your place, even if it's not a place at all. The desert recedes behind you, the dust clings to your coat." And once again, you're reminded that unmarried women have always walked the edges of systems, sometimes watching, sometimes building their own, always, somehow, enduring. You walk into the general store with a list in your pocket and your chin set like flint. Bread flour, lamp oil, 2 feet of ribbon if it's still on sale. The clerk barely looks up, mutters something about the weather, and rings up your items with the distracted energy of a man used to women not speaking unless spoken to. But you speak anyway. Ask if the shipment of writing paper came in. He pauses, looks surprised. Not offended. Just surprised that you'd need something as purposeful as paper. You're used to that look. Single women in 1800s America who dared to support themselves, who could support themselves, were considered unnatural, suspicious, or at best, slightly tragic. The economy wasn't built for you. The laws weren't designed for you. The world tolerated you if you were quiet, pious, and grateful for the scraps. But once you started earning your own money, and worse, enjoying it, that's when things got interesting. You return home with your modest purchases and sit down at your small desk, the one wedged between the hearth and the bookshelf you built yourself. You've taken in some mending for the milliner this week, and your teaching work brings in a steady, if meagre, income. You also write anonymous essays for a local paper under the pseudonym D. Witt. So far, no one's figured out who you are. Or maybe they have and just don't want to admit a woman is smarter than them. You've learned to downplay it all. You say, "Oh, just something to keep me busy," or "It's not real work, just something I do." Because the second you act like your income matters, or worse, like you enjoy earning it, someone inevitably takes offence. That's the heart of it. Society fears a woman who doesn't need a man. A woman who pays her rent on time, chops her own firewood, and still has time left over to write something that makes a man uncomfortable. You can be poor and unmarried, or rich and married, but rich and unmarried, oh no, that's a threat. You think of Miss Jemison, the seamstress 2 towns over who owns her own shop and never looks anyone in the eye. People whisper about her, say she must have had a scandal, that no woman could do what she's done without secrets. No one ever says the same about Mr. Caro, who runs the blacksmiths alone, drinks too much, and once fell asleep on his anvil. Here's your historical fact for tonight. Throughout the 19th century, unmarried women who earned their own living were often written off as eccentrics, bluestockings, or mannish. Their labour was grudgingly accepted if it was invisible: housework, teaching, nursing. But if it became visible, like running a business, publishing, or buying property, they crossed a line. The line between tolerated oddity and perceived danger. And here's your delightful fringe detail. In some towns, the most financially successful women were single female landladies who ran boarding houses for other single women. These places became unofficial networks of mutual support, underground employment offices, gossip havens, and, very occasionally, the kind of house where nobody asked too many questions about who stayed in whose room. You've thought about opening one yourself, not for the profit really, but for the control, to build a space where unmarried women could exist without apology, where they could work, eat, write, laugh, be, without having to wear a mask. The idea lingers like a good line you haven't written down yet. But with independence comes scrutiny. You've had letters from the church committee suggesting you attend more actively. You've noticed the baker's wife won't make eye contact anymore. At a recent town gathering, someone introduced you as the quiet one who writes things, as if that was the whole of you. It stung more than it should have. There's a debate in modern scholarship over women like you. Unmarried, self-supporting, unrepentant. Some argue you were the forerunners of feminism, the silent architects of economic autonomy. Others say you were anomalies, lucky or stubborn or rich enough to ignore the rules. But either way, you existed, and you mattered. You think about it while walking through the market. A boy offers to carry your parcel. You decline, politely. He stares, confused. His mother pulls him away with a whisper. You want to laugh, but instead, you adjust your shawl and keep walking. Your home is small but clean. You know every creak in the floorboards, every stubborn hinge. You've made this space yours, not inherited, not given. Yours. You hang your coat, wash your hands, and sit down to write. Tonight it's a letter to a local magistrate about a proposed change to property taxes. You've drafted it 3 times already. The 4th time, you drop the polite preamble and open with, "It is difficult to imagine this proposal would affect men in the same way." You like the way it sounds, unforgiving, direct, like you've stopped apologizing for breathing. Outside, someone walks past your window and pauses. You hear a muttered voice, a footstep. You don't flinch. Let them wonder what a woman does alone behind glass at night with a pen in her hand. Let them be unnerved. You light another candle. You write until your fingers cramp. You are unmarried. You are employed. You are unbought and unmoved. And you are not afraid. The baby screams for 2 full hours before anyone comes to get you. You're not family. You're not even a nurse. But you're the one who knows how to hold a child when it won't stop crying. You've done it enough times. Nieces, nephews, children of friends, a stranger's baby once at the train station whose mother was too exhausted to move. Your hands know the motion. Slow, steady, heart close to heart. And just like that, this tiny thing softens, sighs, and dribbles onto your shoulder. They call you Auntie, sometimes Miss, never just your name. In the absence of marriage and children of your own, you've become something else entirely. The spinster aunt, the childless helper, the woman who's always there when someone gets sick, needs a dress hemmed, or can't find the box of Christmas ornaments in the attic. You're dependable, available, quietly essential. You never agreed to this role, it just formed around you like frost on a window. Inevitable, a little cold, surprisingly intricate. The married women are too busy, too tired, too distracted. The grandmothers are too slow, and the younger girls are too caught up in courtship or rebellion to remember where the towels are stored. So, that leaves you. The unmarried woman who has just enough time, just enough patience, and just enough distance to be useful without becoming a burden. You know the birthdays, you remember the allergies. You sew the buttons back on when no one else notices they're missing. You've told stories to wide-eyed children while their parents argued softly in the next room. You fetched medicine, stitched wounds, watched for fevers, walked crying babies to sleep under a sky so dark it felt like a curtain closing. And somehow, You've done all of it without belonging to anyone. That's the strange paradox of being a spinster aunt. You're not really in the family, but the family doesn't run right without you. Here's your historical fact for tonight. In the 19th century, childless unmarried women often became caretakers for extended family members. Census records show them living with siblings, nieces, cousins, serving as unpaid labour in households that relied on them for everything from domestic chores to elder care. They weren't servants exactly, but they weren't guests either. They were fixtures. And the quirk, they often held quiet power. The spinster aunt was sometimes the family historian, the secret holder, the executor of wills. She was the one who knew where the money was buried, literally and metaphorically. In some cases, she even controlled small inheritances passed down from other unmarried women, creating an invisible chain of matrilineal wealth, not enough to shake the world, but enough to matter. You've seen this power in small flashes. When the eldest nephew asks you first before making a decision. When a cousin breaks down crying in your lap because you won't judge me. When someone hands you the keys to the house while they're away, not because they must, but because they trust you more than their own spouse. Still, there's a cost. You're never in the portraits. You're the one taking the picture. You're rarely invited to sit down first. You carve your turkey at the kitchen counter, while others toast in the dining room. And when people look back, they often forget you were even there. There's debate, of course. Some scholars argue the spinster aunt was a tragic figure, exploited, overlooked, used, until she was too old to be of service. Others see her as a stabilising force, a soft centre holding crumbling families together. A few even call her subversive, a woman who refused the domestic ideal and found her own path through utility and presence. As always, the truth sits uneasily between the pages. Tonight, you're darning socks by the fire. The children are asleep upstairs. The youngest cried for her mother in her dreams, but when you held her hand, she quieted. You've made tea, strong, unadorned, the kind you only drink when everyone else has gone to bed. You look around the parlour and see the signs of your labour. The mended curtain, the reattached leg on the piano bench, the pile of folded clothes no one asked for but no one ever complains about. You are the keeper of small order. You're not bitter, not tonight. Because sometimes the children write you letters. Little folded notes that say things like thank you for the apples or you make the best stories. One drew a picture of you last year with wings. Because you always fly in when something goes wrong, she said. You saved it. Of course you did. You don't envy the mothers, not when they're crying in the pantry or dragging themselves down the hall with cracked nipples and unbrushed hair. But sometimes you wish you had a place to collapse. Someone to hold your hand when you wake up gasping from dreams of all the things you meant to do but never did. Instead, you pull your shawl tighter. You take your tea to the window. You watch the stars for a while and wonder how many other women are sitting alone in borrowed rooms, wearing borrowed titles, and doing the quiet work of keeping the world from unravelling. You are not a mother. You are not a wife. But you are the reason someone slept through the night. The reason someone found their shoes. The reason someone believes in gentle things. And you begin to understand, not belonging doesn't mean not being loved. It just means no one taught you the words for what you are. So you invent them. You see the building before you hear it. The windows are narrow slits, barred in iron. The front porch sags like it's holding a secret. There's a long gravel path leading up to a door that never opens fast, and even when it does, no one smiles. This is the asylum, just outside town, far enough that the neighbours can forget it's there, but close enough to be used as a warning. Don't get too strange, don't get too loud, don't end up like her. You don't come here often, but you've been before. Today it's because someone's niece, Helen, has been unwell. You're not told more than that. A vague mention of nerves, of episodes, of melancholy that wouldn't lift. She's only 24. She's unmarried, of course. It always starts like that. You're led in by a nurse with a starched apron and the kind of kindness that leaves no warmth behind. The smell hits you first. Soap, bleach, something rotting softly under both. The halls echo in a way that makes you want to speak in whispers even if no one's around. You find Helen sitting by a window, hands folded, eyes unfocused. She doesn't speak. You sit beside her anyway, murmuring soft things, unsure if she hears. The world has always pathologized women's pain, especially when it doesn't serve a man's narrative, hysteria, melancholia, moral insanity. If you're unmarried and begin to crack, if you cry too often, shout when you're not supposed to, or simply stop trying to smile, There's always someone willing to help you into a room with locks on the outside. You've read the case files. Some were sent here for refusing proposals, for talking back, for wandering at night, for reading too many novels. One was institutionalized because she claimed she felt no desire to marry and instead wanted to become a woodworker. That one still haunts you. Here's your historical fact for tonight. In the 1800s, hysteria was a common medical diagnosis for women who exhibited anything from anxiety to sexual desire to sadness. It was a catch-all term rooted in the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus, because obviously it had to be the womb's fault. Treatments included forced rest, isolation, bland diets, leeches, and sometimes surgical removal of the uterus. Yes, really. Women, particularly unmarried ones, were especially vulnerable to being committed by male relatives, a brother, a father. Even a distant cousin could sign the paperwork. Once inside, getting out was another story entirely. And here's your eerie fringe fact. Some asylums had entire wings dedicated to spinsters and widows, women labelled as emotionally unstable simply because they lived alone too long, had too much time to think, or refused to remarry. Some records list solitude as a symptom. Others, argumentative, independent, possessive of opinions. You stare at Helen. She blinks. Her hands tremble slightly. You've been told she refused to eat. But someone here did her hair. Someone braided it neatly, as if to prove she can still be made presentable. You wonder how many times she was asked what she wanted before someone decided what she needed. There's a woman down the hall singing to herself, another pacing in a tight circle, murmuring the same sentence over and over. Don't touch the red ones. No one seems to know what that means. You think about all the times you've stood in your own room, eyes burning, hands shaking, desperate not to cry because someone might hear. Because once you're labelled unstable, they stop listening to what made you that way. They only see the result, not the cause. The scholars are divided. Was hysteria an early, albeit misguided, acknowledgement of mental health struggles in women? Or was it just a weaponized label to control behaviour? Some argue the diagnosis evolved from real suffering. Others see it as a social tool wielded with surgical precision to enforce silence. The reality, like always, sits uncomfortably between the extremes. You leave the asylum after an hour. Helen never says a word. You give her a handkerchief, the one embroidered with violets, and hope she keeps it. Or at least hides it somewhere the nurses won't find. Outside, the air feels too sharp, the sky too large. You gulp it down like medicine. Back in town, you hear someone mention Helen in passing. She was always a little odd, they say. Shame she never married. Might have settled her. You don't respond, you just walk faster. That night you find yourself awake longer than usual. You light a candle, pull out a worn notebook and write Helen's name. Then the names of all the other women you've heard of who were sent away. Some came back, most didn't. You don't know what to do with the list, so you leave it open on your desk just so their names are somewhere. You wonder if they still remember who they were before the diagnosis, before the quiet rooms, before being told their independence was evidence of illness. You boil water, you drink the strongest tea you can make. You whisper into your cup, "I am still here, I am still whole." You say it like a spell, like a promise, like defiance. Because you know now how fine the line is, between eccentric and dangerous, between living alone and being locked away, between surviving and being erased, and you are determined to stay on the right side of that line, even if you have to draw it yourself. You're not one for crowds, generally. Too many elbows, too many smells, too much risk of someone asking you your marital status between bites of cornbread. But this crowd is different. This crowd hums, it buzzes, it breathes in unison. You're standing in a sea of hats and banners and sensible boots. The air tastes like dust and resolve. It's 1896 and you're in the middle of a women's suffrage rally, clutching a sash you still haven't dared to put on. You came as an observer, or so you told yourself. A curious onlooker, just here to listen. But the energy has a way of pulling you in. A woman with freckles and a scar on her chin hands you a pamphlet titled Votes for Women, a constitutional promise. You nod and tuck it under your arm. Then you take another. You've never thought of yourself as political. You were raised to believe that women belonged in parlours, not podiums. But you've also spent most of your life being told what you weren't. Not a wife, not a mother, not complete. Maybe it's time to start declaring what you are. All around you are women of every size and shade. Some wearing corsets, some scandalously without. One woman has a baby strapped to her back and is shouting about tax law with absolute conviction. Another is holding a sign that reads, "Unmarried, not unqualified. You want to hug her. Here's your historical foothold." Unmarried women were at the heart of the American suffrage movement. While married women were often bound, legally and socially, to their husband's politics, unmarried women could act independently. They didn't have to ask permission. They didn't need to worry about how their activism might reflect on a husband's reputation. And because they had no children to distract or anchor them, society assumed they had time, so they used it. Not all of them were radicals. Many were teachers, clerks, editors, women used to being ignored, used to working twice as hard for half the recognition. But in these rallies, these meetings, these speeches shouted into echoing town squares, they found each other. And when unmarried women joined forces, they became very hard to ignore. You step forward as a speaker climbs the podium. She's small, grey-haired, wearing gloves like armour. Her voice cuts clean through the clamour. Do not mistake silence for compliance. Do not mistake unmarried for unworthy. The crowd erupts. You find your hands moving on their own, clapping, then lifting the pamphlet, then finally, tying the sash around your waist. It feels absurd, and right, and dangerous. And now, the quirky twist of the night. Many of the most prominent leaders in the suffrage movement were unmarried women. Susan B. Anthony never married. Neither did Anna Howard Shaw. Frances Willard lived with another woman, and their partnership was never publicly questioned. Though modern historians read between the lines, their single status allowed them to travel, to speak, to write without interference. They built sisterhoods instead of households. Of course, it wasn't all unity and righteousness. The suffrage movement was full of fractures over race, class, tactics, and whose rights should come first. Black women especially were often pushed to the margins or asked to wait their turn, but many refused to step aside. Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, all unmarried at the height of their work, organised, marched and wrote as fiercely as any white counterpart, often more so. Back in the crowd, someone begins a chant. It rises, slow at first, then stronger. Votes for women. Votes for women. You're chanting too before you realise it, your voice mingling with hundreds of others, high and rough and yours. You don't know where this will lead. You've seen the editorials, the satirical cartoons. Unmarried suffragists are mocked as bitter spinsters, mannish, unnatural, laughable. One particularly cruel article claimed women like you were starved of affection and swollen with rage. It's almost impressive how neatly they can weaponize loneliness. But you're not lonely tonight. That evening, after the crowd disperses and the sun dips behind a haze of smoke and sweat, you walk back to your boarding house with a new ache in your feet and a strange lightness in your chest. In your hand is a calling card from a woman named Judith who runs a small printing press and is looking for contributors. You think you might write something about the rally, or about women like you, or about what it feels like to cheer without permission. The scholars, as usual, argue whether suffrage truly freed women or just reshaped the cage. Was the vote a revolution, or a bone tossed by a government tired of shouting? But one thing is clear. The women who fought hardest were often the ones who had no husbands to lose, no households to protect, just voices, just will. You sit at your desk and begin writing, the pen skidding slightly with your excitement. I stood among sisters today, some married, some widowed, many single, but none of us were alone. The ink dries slowly. The words feel right. You are unmarried. You are political. You are not waiting for someone else to speak for you. Not anymore. The door creaks open before you can knock. A woman in a wrinkled apron peeks out, eyes darting past you before settling on your face. "You're the new girl?" she asks, though it doesn't sound like a question. You nod. She steps aside. "Don't leave the stove burning after 10. Don't eat the master's bread. Don't open the parlour window unless someone's bleeding." Then she disappears down the hall. You've taken a position as a domestic servant, maid, housekeeper, companion, all depending on the day. You've worked in finer homes before, but this one has that sour hush that tells you not to ask questions. You're not here for questions. You're here for $3 a month, a small room under the eaves, and a hot meal that tastes like boiled rules. Being an unmarried woman with no property, no family nearby, and no connections has landed you here in the back corridors of someone else's life. Domestic service in 19th century America is both one of the most common professions for unmarried women and one of the most invisible. You live in someone else's house, sleep when they sleep, eat when they say, speak only when spoken to. If you're lucky, they call you by your name. If not, you're just girl. Doesn't matter if you're 16 or 45. You share the attic with 2 other women. Maud is older, mostly deaf, and hasn't smiled since the Lincoln administration. She says she used to be a schoolteacher before life rearranged itself. Lottie is 17 and talks in her sleep. You've already learned her mother died in childbirth, and her father drinks vinegar. You're a family now, not by choice, but by draft. The work is relentless, scrubbing, lifting, polishing, pretending not to hear arguments. You learn the delicate choreography of not being seen, how to pass through rooms like a shadow, how to vanish just before someone remembers to scold you. Your joints ache, your fingertips crack, but you keep going. You have to. Here's your historical fact. By the late 1800s, more than half of the female workforce in America was employed in domestic service. Most were unmarried. Many were immigrants, Irish, German, later Italian. Domestic labour was one of the only respectable jobs available to women who lacked education or family support. It required no references if the work was low enough, and no one asked about your past so long as you scrubbed hard enough to erase it. But the job came with trade-offs. Your time wasn't yours. Neither was your body, not really. You belonged to the household. And sometimes, when the master lingered too long in the kitchen, or the son followed you up the stairs, you realised just how thin your protections really were. That's the quiet horror of this life. The constant awareness that being single, poor, and female makes you the easiest target in any room. And the quirk. Some women found ways to subvert it. Maids who smuggled books under their aprons. Cooks who fed the poor with leftovers wrapped in cloth and passed through back gates. Governesses who taught servants' children to read in secret after hours. Quiet acts of rebellion. You don't need a revolution when you have access to everyone's letters, schedules, and locked drawers. Lottie once showed you a love note she found tucked behind a mirror. It wasn't meant for her. It wasn't even scandalous. But she read it aloud with the reverence of someone who didn't know if love letters ever came addressed to girls like her. You wanted to tell her they did, but not often. You keep your dignity like a folded handkerchief, hidden but clean. Every morning you button your collar. Every night you comb your hair. You save your coins in a chipped teacup behind a loose brick in the pantry wall. You read old sermons aloud to Maud on Sundays, just so she can close her eyes and pretend she's still in a classroom. The debates among historians are often sanitised. Was domestic service empowering because it gave women wages, or degrading because it trapped them in cycles of dependence? The truth is sweatier than that. It was both. It gave you a roof and took your freedom. It fed you but starved your spirit. It taught you how to survive, but rarely how to live. You last in this house for 9 months. One morning, the lady of the house accuses you of stealing a silver spoon. She finds it later, of course, in the laundry basket. No apology, just a frown, as if your innocence has inconvenienced her. That night, you pack your things and leave before dawn, a wrapped loaf of bread under your arm, Maud's last smile tucked somewhere inside your chest. You walk 5 miles to the next town. There's another position open. Maybe this one will be better. Maybe the bed won't creak like regret every time you lie down. Maybe you'll stay longer. Maybe you'll leave sooner. You don't know, but you do know this. You are unmarried, you're unclaimed, and you refuse to be invisible. So when you walk into the next house and the butler says, "And you are?" you meet his eyes, lift your chin, and say your name louder than you ever have before. You wear the corset, like always. You lace it up until your ribs sigh and your waist disappears. It's not vanity, it's uniform. Even unmarried women are expected to obey the shape. You go about your day in a tidy silhouette, chin lifted, posture erect, organs rearranged just so. No one sees the bruises. They're not that kind anyway. They're internal, quiet. The kind of ache that doesn't make a sound. You've read the doctor's pamphlets. You've heard the whispers. Unmarried women die younger, or they die weirder. They waste away from mysterious ailments, their hearts simply giving out, their minds growing too loud. A spinster in her 50s dies and someone says, "Well, she was never quite right." A widow dies alone and it's a shame, probably from sadness. No one ever says it was the corset, or the loneliness, or the fact that she hadn't touched another human being in a decade. Death always finds you eventually. But for women like you, the cause often reads more like a poem than a diagnosis. You keep a small drawer of death notices, Not out of morbidity, at least not entirely, but curiosity. You cut them from newspapers. Sometimes they say beloved daughter, sometimes devoted aunt, rarely anything more. The married women get wife of, mother to, faithful companion of. But the single ones? They get small fonts and modest endings. The death of an unmarried woman in the 1800s doesn't echo. It barely makes a ripple. Unless, of course, it's scandalous. Then suddenly, the town remembers she existed. You recall Miss Lillian from 2 streets over, 53 teacher, known for carrying peppermint in her sleeve and never missing a church meeting. She dropped dead in her garden one summer. Sun hat askew, trowel still in her hand. The doctor said it was female exhaustion, whatever that means. You went to the funeral, her coffin was closed, her legacy was summed up in 4 sentences and 1 lukewarm eulogy that included the phrase, "She did her duty quietly." You left early. Here's your historical fact for the night. In the 19th century, unmarried women were often assigned dubious medical explanations for their decline. Hysteria, again, spinster's consumption, old maid's melancholy. These weren't clinical diagnoses, they were social shorthand, a way to say she didn't fit and now she's gone. Doctors, mostly male, documented these deaths with a mix of indifference and poetic flair. One even wrote that a single woman had died from having too few distractions of the heart. It's amazing how much nonsense can fit on a death certificate. And here's your oddity. Corsets were occasionally blamed for spontaneous death, particularly in women who lived alone. Stories circulated of women fainting and never waking up, their bodies found stiff in front of mirrors, laces still tight. Of course, these reports were often dramatised, but the truth wasn't much kinder. Tight-laced corsets could cause internal bleeding, restrict breathing, and reshape the ribcage permanently, especially when worn daily for decades, especially when there was no one around to say, maybe you could just take it off. Sometimes you wonder what your obituary would say. Miss Cartwright passed quietly in her sleep. Or Miss Cartwright, long-time schoolteacher and solitary resident of Jefferson Street. That's the trick. No matter what you do, the unmarried part always comes first. It becomes the headline. You imagine writing your own. She never married. She did not wish to. She lived as she pleased and left the linens folded. There's something satisfying about that. But not all unmarried deaths are quiet. There's a case from a decade ago. A woman named Ruth, single in her 40s, found dead in her boarding room with a stack of letters and a broken wrist. The letters were addressed to another woman. The story made the papers. Speculation ran wild. Some said she fell. Some said she jumped. Some said she died of heartbreak. You saved the article. You still reread it when the silence feels too loud. And here's the debate. Were these deaths the product of loneliness or the cost of resistance? Did these women suffer because they lacked companionship or because the world punished them for not needing it? Modern historians can't agree. Some romanticize them, others pity them, but few truly see them. You light a candle and stare into the flame. You've outlived your own expectations. You were supposed to marry by 23, have 2 children by 28, be dead by 40 if the local rumours about spinsters were true, but here you are, 51, alive. Not in spite of being unmarried, but because of it. Still, you think about death. How could you not? You've attended more funerals than weddings. You've memorised the order of hymns for every denomination in town. You know which pastors cry and which ones fake it. You've comforted widows who used to pity you and wept with girls who've lost their mothers. You've read every line of every woman's book of endings, and still you haven't found one that feels quite like yours. Tonight you remove your corset before dinner, no one's around to scold you, you breathe deeper than you have in years. The ribs creak, but they don't crack. You sip your tea without sugar and consider the shape of your life, not curved like an hourglass, but straight, stubborn, unbowed. Not a tragedy, not a cautionary tale, just a woman who didn't wait to be chosen to begin existing. If the paper prints your death one day, let them call you unmarried. Let them call you anything they like. But you hope someone somewhere will remember how you lived, and not just how you left. You received the letter on a Wednesday, folded crisp, the ink dark and elegant, the handwriting too beautiful to belong to anyone ordinary. The return address is unfamiliar, somewhere near Boston, but the name at the bottom makes your heart pause mid-beat. Clara. You haven't seen her in 17 years, not since the afternoon you stood beside her at the train station, both trying not to say too much, both knowing it would be the last time even if you lied about writing. Now here she is, resurfacing in the final years of the century, asking if you'd consider visiting her. "I have a house now," she writes, "and a library, and no one to argue with me about either. Come before the snow turns ugly. You pack your bag within the hour. Clara was your friend. At least that's what you said when people asked. You met in your 20s, when you were both teaching at the same school in St. Louis, both unmarried, both sharp in your own ways. She played the violin. You recited poetry with a dry wit that made her laugh too loud. You shared books, bad coffee, winter scarves. Eventually you shared a room, and then a bed. Quietly, carefully. It was never labelled. Not even between the two of you. Back then there weren't words for it that didn't come with shame. Or if there were, you didn't know how to use them. You just knew that Clara made the world feel less jagged, that her hands in your hair steadied something you didn't know was shaking. The relationship faded when she left to care for a sick aunt in the East. You told people she was your dearest friend, and in a way she was. Now, all these years later, you're knocking at her door, heart thudding in rhythms you thought you'd outgrown. She answers in a plain blue dress, her hair longer than you remember, streaked with silver. She looks at you like she's read every word you never wrote. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten how to travel," she says, and you step inside. Her home is warm and quiet. A fireplace murmurs in the corner. Books line every wall, stacked 2 rows deep in some places. A vase of fading lilac sits on the windowsill. There's no husband, no children's toys, just Clara, and the scent of old pages and black tea. Here's your historical fact. Intimate relationships between women in the 19th century were common and widely documented, though not always acknowledged as romantic or sexual. Known as romantic friendships, these connections often included shared households, lifelong correspondence, and emotional intensity that modern readers might interpret as queer. At the time, society allowed such bonds, as long as they remained unspoken and fit within the boundaries of acceptable femininity. But here's the fringe detail. Some of these women lived together for decades, referred to by their communities as spinsters, companions, or Boston marriages. The term, coined in reference to educated women who supported themselves and chose to live together, described relationships that were often deeply romantic, even if history tried to file them under roommates. Clara brings you tea and you sit on her worn velvet settee. She tells you about her life, her writing, her neighbours, the garden that refuses to bloom unless cursed at. You tell her about your students, your aching joints, your latest arguments with God. The old rhythm returns quickly. She still finishes your sentences. You still steal her biscuits. There's a quiet after dinner where neither of you speaks. The fire crackles. Outside, snow begins to fall in big, lazy flakes. You reach for her hand without thinking. She lets you. "I never married," she says, a little too fast. "I couldn't have, not after..." She doesn't finish. She doesn't need to. You nod. Same. There's a debate always in how we remember women like you. Were you just friends? Were you closeted before closeting was even named? Were you desperate or simply honest in a world that preferred lies? Historians disagree. The evidence is often coded. Letters signed, "Yours forever." Photographs with arms entwined. Diaries with lines scratched out, rewritten to sound more acceptable. But between the lines, you see it. You feel it now. You stay at Clara's house for 3 days. On the second night you sleep in her bed again. Nothing is said. Nothing needs to be. Her hand finds yours beneath the quilt. She still runs warmer than you do. You fall asleep with her breath soft against your neck and wake feeling more whole than you have in years. When you leave, she presses a book into your hands. Emily Dickinson, wrapped in a ribbon. She whispers, "Don't wait so long next time." You nod, lips trembling, throat closed tight. You kiss her cheek. You wish it could be more. On the train ride home, you sit by the window, the book clutched like a talisman. You think about all the women who never got to say what they meant, who wrote their love in the margins, who slept in the same bed for 40 years and were still called spinsters in the obituaries. You won't correct them, but you won't let them be forgotten either. You're unmarried. You're uncategorized. You're part of a history that refused to name you, but couldn't quite erase you either. And somewhere, in a quiet house in Boston, another woman is thinking of you too. The world is shifting beneath your boots, and for once it's not just your imagination. There are typewriters in offices now, clacking like restless insects. The electric street lamps buzz overhead, turning night into something that feels less holy. Trains run faster, steam pumping through cities like veins. You walk past a woman riding a bicycle, her skirt scandalously short, ankle length but still, and she winks at you. You nearly trip on a crack in the sidewalk. It's 1901. A new century, they keep saying, a new age. But you're still here, unmarried and unrepentant, watching the world try to rewrite itself without quite knowing where to shelve people like you. You've lived long enough to be outdated and then updated again. What was once called unnatural is now curious. Modern, even. Some whisper that a woman who chooses to live alone is perhaps not so pitiful after all, but a little dangerous maybe, a little interesting. You don't mind that last one. You've rented a room in a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Dorsey, who has been widowed for 20 years and talks about her late husband with the fondness one might reserve for a particularly handsome goldfish. He never said much, God bless him, she says every Sunday over toast. You've come to love her stories. She lets you stay at a discount in exchange for helping her write letters and fix the books. Sometimes she asks if you've ever been in love. You say, not the kind that needed a wedding. She laughs and refills your tea. You're surrounded by other women now, some divorced, some widowed, some like you, never touched by matrimony. It's a community stitched together not by blood or law, but by resilience. Mrs. Dorsey calls you all her seasoned girls. You've all learned to carry your own trunks, negotiate rent, and deal with nosy landlords who think being unmarried means you have nothing better to do than explain yourself. Here's your historical fact. By the turn of the 20th century, unmarried women in America had carved out more visible social roles. Many worked as secretaries, nurses, writers, and educators. Some even pursued higher education, thanks to the emergence of women's colleges like Vassar and Wellesley. These women were dubbed New Women, a term that sparked both admiration and alarm depending on who you asked. They rode bikes, smoked cigarettes, read Darwin and Whitman, and lived alone in cities. They weren't waiting for anything, and the odd little twist. A lot of people assumed these women would regret it. Newspapers ran op-eds warning of the unsexed spinster. Medical journals still published theories about reproductive atrophy in women who remained childless. But those same women, they were the ones writing those op-eds, editing those journals and running the presses, sometimes under male pseudonyms, sometimes not. You begin writing more openly now, no pseudonyms, no initials, just your full name, printed in the corner of essays and editorials and letters to the editor. You write about education for girls, about the absurdity of being told to marry for stability when your own finances are cleaner than half the town's merchants, about the quiet dignity of solitude. People send you letters in response, some are kind, some are not. One man writes that he'd gladly show you a real woman's place if you weren't so thoroughly dried out. You cut that one up and use it to line the birdcage. You don't have a bird, but the metaphor pleases you. There's a young girl in the house named Elise, 22, full of fire and frustration. She comes to you often, storming into your room mid-rant about the unfairness of things, that her brothers inherit while she's told to sit and wait, that men can sleep around and be forgiven, while women who read poetry alone are suspected of moral collapse. You let her vent, you pour tea, you lend her your copy of Jane Eyre and say, "He wasn't worth the trouble anyway." She calls you Miss Cartwright, even though you've told her to use your first name. She says it with respect, though, with the kind of reverence you didn't expect to earn just by staying alive and staying unmarried. There's still debate, of course, even now. Did these new women truly want independence, or were they forced into it? Were they empowered or simply out of options? Some historians argue they were proto-feminists. Others see them as transitional figures, products of changing times, not agents of them. You're not sure it matters. You lived it. You didn't need a theory. You had rent to pay and questions to answer. At night, you walk the streets when the gas lamps buzz and the air smells like coal and cheap soap. You look into windows and see families gathered, wives leaning over pots, husbands slouched in chairs. You feel no envy, just a small, flickering gratitude that your life has been your own. You've travelled, you've written, you've taught. You've survived at least 4 economic recessions, 2 near proposals, 1 very persuasive cello player, and an entire decade of being pitied by people whose lives collapsed quietly under the weight of conformity. You are unmarried. You're not a mother. You're not a wife. You're something else entirely. And in this new century, electric, complicated,